for the 81st CPTD. I'm just going to say a few quick words before we start our program. Not having success. I am having trouble advancing the slides. First of all, happy Father's Day to everybody. I wanted to say that before I continued. So I am going to start with some thanks. First, we have to start with a thanks for the program committee, who really does everything for this meeting, and the whole meeting rides on their hard work. So Bill Stoops is the chair, Kelly Dunn is the chair-elect coming on, and I'd like to thank all the members of that committee, as well as the executive office, Loretta Finnegan, Ellen Geller, Angela Prideaux, Nico Smith, and Chris Wolf for their hard work getting this program going. It looks fantastic this year. I'd also like to thank the executive committee. You know, as president, you work very hard with this group of people, and they're an extremely thoughtful, reasonable, and fantastic group to work with. You know, we don't always agree on everything, and we've made some difficult decisions this past year, but it's wonderful to know you can trust each one of these individuals. Everyone is making decisions for this organization that we love so much, and so I'm very grateful to have worked with them this past year. Next, of course, we thank the board of directors, who also does a lot of work for this organization. And I'd like to highlight the 4 who are going to be retiring off the board after this meeting is over. So Patrick Beardsley, Kathleen Carroll, Marilyn Carroll, and Jennifer Tidy, as well as welcome the new elected members, Erin Winstanley, Dossie Svikas, Wendy Lynch, and Jermaine Jones. So welcome aboard, and thank you. And next, I'd like to highlight Alan Budney. So when after you finish your term as president of CPTD, you become the chair of the Long Range Planning Committee. And Alan has set a very high bar for me, I'm afraid. He has really taken on 2 enormous initiatives this year to really stabilize the finances of CPTD, because that's really our main charge as members of the board. So he has investigated a major giving campaign to see if we could raise funds to stabilize our finances that way, and has also done a lot of work with his committee exploring alternative models of managing CPTD for the future. So you'll be hearing more about that, but again, a round of applause for Alan and this committee for a lot of hard work. And Sandy Comer, who we like to acknowledge every year because, again, probably few of you are aware of how much work goes into the public policy, and Sandy has really brought a lot of energy to this position. There are bills going through Congress that impact many of us in this organization about scheduling of drugs, and Sandy is right on top of it with Ed Long and Katie Van Landingham at Van Scoyac to stay on top of it and to write letters from CPTD to support bills that are important to all of us, and also to organize this advocacy day on the Hill. And again, for those of you who haven't done this, I just can't encourage you enough to volunteer to go. It's usually in late January, early February, and we go to DC, and Ed and Katie set up these meetings with key members of Congress where we can go and talk about the important work that we all do and advocate for more funding for NIDA. And it has an impact. It's incredibly important. And I was nervous about doing this, but again, your hand is held the whole time. You're really set up and instructed on how to do this. So please really think about joining us. This is our 3rd visit, and it's growing each year, and it's a really exciting and rewarding opportunity. So we thank Sandy for this, because she's doing an enormous amount for all of us here. So I just also, I wanted to highlight a few people for this. Right after Advocacy Day, Jeff Mumford from APA and also CPTD and Friends of NIDA organized this Congressional Hill briefing on cannabis. For those of you not in the cannabis field, it's shocking how difficult it is to conduct any research with cannabis and cannabinoids, despite our society just liberalizing everything, it's gotten even harder for scientists to do carefully controlled research. So we had this opportunity, Elise Weirtz, Alan Budney, Nora Volkoff, and I, to give a presentation to the Hill on this, organized by Jeff and these groups. And in addition, you know, as president, you can ask people to write a position statement. And so Ryan Vandry, Elise Weirtz, and Mahmoud El Soli wrote this position statement on cannabis research just so we can point to the difficulties we all face. And it's on our website. And so they've done a lot of hard work in getting this together for us. And it's something we could hand to members of Congress to show how hard our work is. So thank you to Ryan and Jeff and Mahmoud and Elise. So on to a sadder note, we've had a really tragic year this year at CPDD. Nancy Petrie, Herb Kleber, who I worked with for over 20 years, Albert Hertz, and David Alsop, all were tragically lost. There is a brochure where we talk a lot about the work that they did and their contributions to CPDD, but it's been a very difficult year for us. And more recently, Lou Harris passed away, and it was too late for us to add him to the brochure, so I just wanted to, Bill Dewey gave me some highlights of the important work of Lou Harris. And for this organization in particular, he was a real leader before we were even a college. He was chair on the Committee on Problems of Drug Dependence, CBD president, Eddie Award winner. He was the chair of the Department of Pharmacology and Toxicology at the Medical College of Virginia. And he really led the evaluation of physical dependence liability, testing new opioid-like compounds, and he was a really dedicated scientist and such an important part of CPDD. So what I'd like to do is just ask for a moment of silence for all 5 of these losses of our community. Thank you. I just also wanted to highlight some work we've done in the past year. One initiative is membership diversity initiative that we're working on and still are working on. We added a commitment to diversity to our website. The college and its members actively promote diversity and inclusion within the college and within our field, not limited to race, ethnicity, religion, disability, age, sex, gender identity, or sexual orientation. But I really ask of you, we need data. CPDD is really behind in this. We have no information on our demographics. And without that, it's very difficult for us to know where to address problems. So we're working with the underrepresented committee and Jack Henningfield. Jack has been a huge boost to us in trying to develop ways to collect demographic data on membership and on meeting attendees. So please be on the lookout for our requests and help us to get an understanding on where we stand on this issue. It's our hope that we, perhaps in concert with NIH and other scientific organizations, can formulate strategies to address the shortcomings, but we need data to do so. So this will be coming, but I wanted to alert you all to this beforehand to know why we're doing this. The other initiative we had this past year was a Code of Conduct initiative, and we sent this out to the membership prior to the meeting, and we'll be doing more with this in the oncoming year, but I organized a Code of Conduct working group where we developed a policy so that our meeting attendees know that there is a procedure in place to respond to harassment or discrimination, and I wanted to ensure that our members understand our expectations. We'll be integrating this more into registration for 2020. This is on our website, but again, you'll be hearing more from us, and give us feedback as we go. This is something it's still a work in progress, but again, I think we were a little bit behind in getting this off the ground. So just some highlights of this morning. We'll be hearing the Eddie Award lecture with Maxine Stitzer, My Brilliant Career, Behavioral Pharmacology, Contingency Management, and more. There's also the Fishman Award lecture with Henry Jones. That's going to be on Monday between 2 to 3. And I get to organize a president's lecture. That's one of the perks of this job. The title of this is The Impact of Tobacco Use on Other Substance Use Disorders, Epidemiology to Mechanism. And so these are my colleagues who will be speaking with me, and that's today at 1 o'clock. And so I wanted to thank Erin Winstanley and Meg Chisholm, who have worked with us really to energize our social media presence. So just some highlights. Again, our goal is to advance addiction science and science-based dialogue. I urge you all to be polite and respectful of your colleagues, but in your first slide, try to include your Twitter handle, CBDD19, or hashtag CBDD19, and also hashtag Night of Science to promote any findings that were supported by NIDA funding, probably the majority. And there is a Twitter competition, so there's a first and second place competition award for those who have the most tweets that include hashtag CBDD19. And so finally, I just want to encourage you all to participate. There's so many ways, but one way is to join one of our many committees. I say this to the younger people in particular, you have no idea how this can strengthen your reputation as a person who contributes. And as scientists, that's kind of our integrity. We contribute and we do what is asked of us in a timely manner. So believe me, from a leadership position, we see those who do work hard for CBDD, but it's to your benefit. You're going to meet people outside your direct area of interest. And, our unique strength at CBDD is the diverse science. And so being a member of a committee, you're going to encounter people from all different angles of addiction science. And, it's to your benefit. Attend the business meeting. This is poorly attended. We think it's in part people don't know that they're welcome or invited, so all members are welcome. We really welcome your opinion. You could shape the future because part of what we do at the business meeting is vote on a nominating committee who then goes and picks future board of director members and the next president. So it's really important to come. We have a members in training group here at CBDD. These are people on their way to becoming members, and they are fantastic, very energized, very enthusiastic, signing up for committees. So I think our future is in good hands with this group of members in training. But please, if you're a member in training, come too. You're not allowed to vote at the business meeting, but we really welcome your input on all other matters. So after the meeting, we always have a survey, and again, I don't know if people are aware of how much we listen to this survey. So we've made big changes based on survey response, but it's not all that well attended to. So make your voice heard. This is a 4-day meeting in response to our survey results. We'll see how it goes. At the end of the meeting, let us know how you like it. There still is some flexibility in what we do in the future. But we decide where meetings are held, or if people have a very strong opinion, it informs our decisions on that. We're not having a dinner gala in response to this survey. So again, this has a lot of weight to it. On a more business-related note, please try to visit the exhibitors we have. We tend not to be great at that, and they're very, very important to our financial health. So if you see somebody of interest to you, please stop by. And just to end, you get more out of an organization when you get involved. So that's my last parting words, is just get involved in CBDD. So with that, I'd like to conclude. And again, thank you all for coming. This is the start of an exciting meeting, and we're happy to be underway. So thank you. So next, I'd like to invite Dr. Volkoff from NIDA, as you all are aware, to give us a report on NIDA's news.
Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here, and actually it's a great opportunity for me to try to bring you up to date in some of the challenges that we are facing, but also on how there may be opportunities for all of you as scientists. And just before coming up here, I was thinking about how there is a chance for each one of us within our different disciplines to participate in addressing some of the major challenges that we're facing as a country in terms of drugs and addiction. I do want to follow Meg's in terms of recognition of the people that we have lost, because we've lost people that have transformed our field. And I do want to highlight two more that also have been fundamental in building the basis of our knowledge about how neurotransmitters that are affected by drugs ultimately work. And that, of course, is Paul Greengard and Gabriel Pasternak. And their contributions are just phenomenal. And I think that it's a terrible loss, and it's very sad. I actually wish that it wasn't the situation, but it is. And I think that the way that we honor them is by continuing with the science, by using their knowledge, by being inspired by what they did. I think these were extraordinary people, and in a way they are with us because they left so many things behind. The NIDA budget, actually I'm dividing it in two portions because, as you know, there's, our budget for NIDA itself for 2019 is $1,158 million. But then Congress had allocated $250 million to go into the base of NIDA, except that these funds are actually very different from other funds in that all of the projects that get funded through this award are ultimately have to be approved by the director's office at the NIH and are not necessarily just for NIDA grants. And some of those resources, for example, are going to other institutes that have the scientific expertise that can help advance our mission. And nonetheless, most of the bulk of the 250 million, I would say probably between 200 million to 210, have basically been selected of projects that come from the National Institute on Drug Abuse. And while a lot of the funds have been allocated between this and next year, the idea is to keep $50 million open for new projects to continue to actually develop. So before I start overall in terms of what are some of the research priorities, I think it's important to look at the landscape. And I removed the slide that actually shows what I've been showing you in the past 2 or 3 years, coming from the Monitoring the Future survey, in which we're showing some of the lowest rates of drug use among 8, 10, and 12th graders in our country. And that pertains to illicit drugs and licit ones. And you will be hearing my colleague, Dr. George Koof, present data showing that alcohol in teenagers has been going down significantly. And we also know that smoking of cigarettes has been going down. It's also notable, and I mentioned it last year, that we have the lowest rates of heroin use among teenagers, even though heroin use in the rest of the population is going up. And as similarly, we have very low rates of cocaine, as we're starting to see with methamphetamine, cocaine and going up significantly. So there's something, and I brought up this explicitly because I think it's a challenged scientific question that is protecting teenagers from the use of drugs right now. And understanding what those factors may be is fundamental so that we can preserve them. But importantly, recognizing that now what we're observing, the greatest risk in terms of very significant increases in drug use are in the transition from adolescence to adulthood, young adulthood. So this is in general for basically most of the drugs. In the case of marijuana, we have not seen decreases as we have seen for the other drugs, and the levels are very, very stable. And you see here in your graph to your left, the daily use of marijuana in 8, 10, and 12 graders, and it's almost like an horizontal line. And the numbers actually to your right show you the percentage itself, which is actually quite high. If you think about it, in 12th graders that are at school, 6% of them basically use marijuana regularly. This is very relevant because while the numbers of regular use of marijuana have been stable, the content of 9-THC has gone up, and you'll see the graphs. And these are kids that actually are in school, and as you know, when you are in school and you're a regular marijuana user, you're much more greater risk of relapsing. So it's very likely that at this age group, the prevalence is higher, but those individuals will not be actually scored in the Monitoring the Future, which is a school-based survey. The graph to the right, you've also seen it, and this is past month. This is not daily, but the same thing happens if we were portraying daily smoking cigarettes versus daily smoking marijuana. Here is month marijuana versus month cigarettes. And you can see that many more kids right now in the United States are smoking marijuana, many more than they are smoking cigarettes, which is, of course, reflects the fact that we have been very effective in doing a campaign to preventing smoking cigarettes. Now, I want you to remember that number for smoking cigarettes, because it's last month, 7.6% of teenagers smoke cigarettes in the past month, and of cigarettes smoked in the past month. So those numbers actually are extraordinary in terms of prevention, but we are now facing a major challenge. And the major challenge relates to vaping. And vaping, as you know, has been going up, particularly among teenagers. How much has it been going up? You can see that right now, among 12th graders, past year vaping is endorsed by 37.3%. And we started this measure 3 years ago. It's a very new behavior, and it has been basically very, very rapidly incorporated into the behavioral repertoire of teenagers. You can see in 8th, 10th, and 12th grade what they are saying they are using vaping. They are using vaping for nicotine, is the main one, and if you look at it, it is basically 30% of the teenagers are using vaping devices to smoke nicotine. It's also something that is changed extremely rapidly, so I have data there for 2017 and 2018, in which you actually see the differences on what teenagers are telling about what they are using vaping. Last year, in 2017, most teenagers said that they use vaping just for flavor. In 1 year, we are starting to see kids reporting that they are vaping nicotine much more than flavor. And we now see, if you look at those numbers, approximately 30% of the teenagers, 12th graders, saying that they are vaping nicotine. And that's why I wanted you to pay attention to that number of tobacco smoking, because we have brought it down to less than 8%. Now kids are being exposed to nicotine through vaping devices, which are very, very effective delivery systems for actually reaching the brain, and high concentrations of nicotine. Also for cannabis, this is another favorite route for the use of cannabis. And this is what expects us in the future. So we need to try to understand this is fundamental, it's not going to go away. Hopefully, as this data is emerging, people are becoming concerned, and there will be a greater regulation that, and also I would hope prevention campaigns, because if we don't do it, the fear is, of course, that we are going to be starting to get some of these teenagers transitioning into combustible tobacco, as some of the data is already starting to show. So, as you know, one of our priorities, which we do in very close collaboration with the Alcohol Institute, and George has been an incredible leader in this project, and that project that has been directed both at NIDA and the Alcohol Institute, with participation with other institutes, and Gaia Dowling and Susan Weiss have played a fundamental role. And again, the staff has been extraordinary in basically making it a success. The PIs, which I also give them enormous amount of credit, have been able to actually complete the recruitment of 11,875 participants, all of which basically have completed the first evaluation, which is a comprehensive assessment for brain imaging parameters, as well as physical, psychological, behavioral characterization. We're now starting the second wave of imaging, and the studies are proceeding. The data was released in its entirety on April of this year, and I urge you, and there's actually to go into the website, there is a website that enables you to actually extract information, and you as a researcher start to ask important questions. It's the largest database ever that exists in terms of brain imaging of very young teenagers, 9 to 10 years old, or children, what you want to call it, that already has started to lead to very interesting publications that are coming not just from the PIs that were involved in the recruitment and evaluation of subjects, but very importantly, individuals that were not. Highly recommend you take advantage of this extraordinary resource for exploring data. This is what I was promising you, the data in terms for as of 2017, what is the content average for 9-THC of marijuana that's requisitioned by the DEA that NIDA analyzes, and you can see that no, it's not waving our hands when we say the marijuana of 2018 has absolutely nothing to do with the marijuana of 2000. And so therefore, it's not surprising that a lot of the adverse effects that we're observing now with marijuana were not present in the past. Very worrisome, of course, in terms of what does that do to the adolescent or the children's brain or the fetal brain, since more women that are pregnant are getting exposed to marijuana. It's not stopping, and you can see that the legalization across the United States is expanding. There's 10 states and the DC that actually have legalized marijuana for recreational purposes, and more than double that has legalized it for medical purposes. So this is expanding at a time, of course, when we're seeing the content of 9-THC going up. What are the consequences? You can predict that drug becomes more available, normative data perspective towards it becomes actually changed. Of course, more people are going to be exposed to marijuana. And while we're not seeing increases in teenagers per se, we're not seeing decreases, it's stable. We're seeing increases in 18 to 25 over a 2-year period. You can see 10% increase. This is past month of marijuana, 22% of those individuals between 8 to 25, 22% are exposed to marijuana on a monthly basis. And then older than 26, you see an increase of 23%. So these are very, very large increases if you think about the fact that we're just actually speaking of 3 years. What are the consequences? Yes, consequences are likely to, therefore, more people smoke, higher content THC, more adverse effects. So I'm bringing you data from an emergency department in San Diego, a large one, that actually has been plotting the number of admissions to emergency department that are associated with cannabis. You can see an 8-fold increase over an 8-year period. This is not going to be stopping. This is not something that's specific to San Diego. Similar numbers, for example, have been reported in emergency departments in Denver, Colorado. So it's also exposing us to the recognition that there were syndromes, medical syndromes, that we didn't know about, like hyperemesis. That was really identified until probably close to a little bit more than 10 years ago, and they didn't know that it was from marijuana. We're starting to see emergence of other syndromes that, while not clear right now that they are marijuana, it's very likely that they are. And certainly everybody has been hearing in the media the number of acute psychosis has risen enormously, since now we recognize clearly that's a consequences of high-content 9-THC. So that is, we have many problems in our country that are not just the opioid crisis, that are very, very important, that we need to continue to move. At the same time, we have to face a situation that is devastating because of the enormous amounts of toll that it's bringing in terms of life and cost to the citizens. And this is the data for the opioid crisis in terms of mortality. You've been seeing me present it for the past 5 years. You can see that the curves that come from heroin and prescription opioids seem to be stabilizing. They're not going down, but they are stabilizing. So it appears that the very active campaigns towards decreasing the number of prescription of opioids and decreasing the doses and the number of pills that are given in each prescription is actually restricting the amount of diverted prescription opioids, making it harder for people to take. Similarly, while heroin has been coming into the country at very high quantities, very high purity, low cost, it seems to be going down, the number of deaths. Now what we are observing is a dramatic increase in deaths from synthetic opioids. And you see that black curve there is 28,466 people dying from synthetic opioids. The one that's most frequently recognized is fentanyl. It's not the only one. We have surfentanyl, we have carfentanil, and in most of those instances, what's interesting about it, and I think it tells us a challenge for us in the field, is drug combination. So it's heroin with fentanyl, is fentanyl with other drugs like alcohol or benzodiazepines. So it's drug combinations that right now are accounting for the majority of the overdose deaths, and that is a big challenge. So what are we doing? We are actually very lucky, I always say it, and I don't give it for granted that we have 3 different classes of medications that are very, very effective in decreasing opioid use, opioid-related overdose deaths, criminal activity, infectious disease transmission, increased social functioning, retention in treatment, and yet we don't use them. And we don't use them because they are stigmatized, the notion that you're just changing one drug for the other, and there's stigma, of course, of the person that's addicted. So the resources that are necessary to address, to be able to bring these medications are not there because we're treating addiction still differently, despite everything that the science is showing us. That's one. And the second one is the structural system that we have is not helping us. Number one, we don't have sufficient treatment programs for providing access to these medications. Number two, those treatment programs may not follow evidence-based practices. And number three, the other reality that we have is that while you significantly protect the life of people that have an opioid use disorder by giving them medications, whether it is methadone, buprenorphine, or naltrexone, you significantly increase the likelihood that they stay alive. 50% of them will relapse to drug taking within 6 months. So the challenge that we have is how do we, on the one hand, change the stigma, and I believe that by building up knowledge and coming up with solutions to address the diseases of addiction, we will change stigma. In the meantime, how is it that we can accelerate and improve the outcomes of individuals suffering from an opioid use disorder? I've said it in the past, I continue to say it because I actually can understand perfectly well. Complying with everyday taking of medication is not an easy task, particularly if you have to go to a methadone clinic for which you have to drive 1 hour, 1 hour and a half, where you're going to be feeling actually pointed at. I mean, you go to a methadone clinic, and some patients feel very uncomfortable to go there, apart from the fact that they don't have easy access to one of them. That's one. Then we have ultimately buprenorphine. Buprenorphine is quite effective, but to have to take the drug, just like methadone, making the decision of going to the doctor or daily or regularly taking your pill on a regular basis is hard. If any one of you have, I mean, all of us have been on medications, and sort of it's not difficult to forget to take it or to just sort of say, oh, I feel good today, I'm stopping my antibiotics. And then, of course, we relapse. So how is it that what is it that we can do to actually make it easier for patients to be compliant, make it easier for them to actually feel comfortable engaging in treatment? And so one of the priorities, because it can lead to products very, very rapidly that can have solution and an impact, is create new formulation of these 3 very effective medications. For an antagonist, naltrexone, we have a 1-month formulation, Vivitrol, that actually therefore protects the individual for 4 weeks. But the big challenge is, wouldn't it be really wonderful if we could have an extended release formulation of naltrexone for 3 months or 6 months? And the same story goes for methadone and buprenorphine. And of course, as you know, I mean, first of all, before we go there, one of the things that we have been very interested on is having also say, well, maybe we are delusional because we are the government and neither is funding this research. So let's figure out if it's really true that these medications are one of the most important tools that we have to fight the crisis before we start to invest all of those resources. So the National Academy of Sciences, Medicine, and Engineering recently released their analysis. This was a task that both SAMHSA and NIDA asked them to look at the data, scientific, and come up with recommendations as regards to medication for opioid use disorder. And their conclusion, and I urge you to read it, actually there's I think seven points over there, is that they save lives. And that not providing them is actually akin, in a way, to malpractice, to not follow evidence-based interventions. They go on to actually highlight the opportunity that we have and the need to bring these medications into the justice setting. They highlight the fact that we are actually, there is a problem with inequity, that African American, that women are less likely to be prescribed some of these medications. And they also highlight point number 4, which is very important, a lack of availability of behavioral interventions is not justification to withhold medications for opioid use disorders. And this is fundamental because while behavioral interventions can improve outcome for certain patients, the reality is that in some instances, clinicians cannot provide those behavioral interventions, don't have the infrastructure, it's much more costly, and so they cannot provide the medication, and this interferes with patients having benefit from it. So in that basis, we go ahead and say, well, how can we make it easier for patients to get these medications and be compliant with them? So one of our partnerships has been, we've done partnerships in terms of we recognize that we need to work with pharmaceutical industry to facilitate the transition of these projects. This is a collaboration that we had established with this one is Indivior, to develop 1 month buprenorphine. There's another collaboration with Braeburn that also has a 1 week and a 1 month product. This is the product that was currently approved in 2018, sorry, and actually shows why it could be highly, highly desirable. This is a 1 month buprenorphine injectable that Indivior has in 2 doses. So, but before I show you the data for the Indivior compound, I want you to be aware why this can be so much of a changer in terms of outcomes. We've been all, of course, very sensitized to the notion that one of the problems that we're facing in terms of treating people, and particularly treating them if they are taking drugs that are very, very potent, like fentanyl or carfentanil, is whether the medications that we are using will be sufficient to actually prevent overdoses from them. And yet we already have data from 2007 that shows that they would, that indeed we have the evidence that the medications that we have prevent the binding, in this case of carfentanil. How do we know it? Because we have a PET ligand, a positron emission tomography ligand, that is labeled with carbon-11, carfentanil labeled with carbon-11, which is used widely to measure mu-opioid receptors. And in this paper of 2007, what the researchers were doing was the extent to which buprenorphine, given orally, was able to block the binding of carfentanil, which is one of the most potent opioids that we know of, that is actually associated with an extraordinary high mortality risk. What you can see 4 hours after you get oral buprenorphine, there's no carfentanil binding in the brain. At 28 hours, you start to see some binding, highlighting the importance of the question, what are the doses that are required to sustain that occupancy of the receptors if we want to protect an individual from not overdosing when they are in these medications? And that's where I show you the data from Indivior, because this is plasma concentration with the two actually doses, the high dose in red, the lower dose in purple. And the horizontal line is the plasma content that you need in order to prevent craving and withdrawal symptoms. It's 3 nanograms per milliliter. And you can see that both formulations actually go over it, and there is a cumulative effect. The question is that sufficient to actually protect and block overdoses? I would say it's probably not, because researchers have gone and looked at what is the level of occupancy by 3 nanograms per milliliter, and it's approximately 80% or 85%, which actually still leaves the opportunity to generate an overdose from drugs that are as potent as fentanyl or carfentanil. But when you can see how the concentration is going up. It is very likely that these formulations, which are going to lead to very high, stable levels, will be able to provide protection, and in the process, because they don't have these fluctuations up and down, prevent the relapse itself, which actually you are 3 nanograms per milliliter shortly after you take it orally, but 20 hours later you are not. And that's where the person becomes more vulnerable. This is, again, why it's so important to develop these extended formulations. Plus, it's easier. I also want to highlight another big challenge, because I'm throwing it at you. You actually are the ones that have to come up with solutions. We have been hearing, and there are publications out there, that when people die or when people overdose on fentanyl or other analogs, many times they cannot be reverted when given naloxone. And that has led some to question whether naloxone does not have sufficient potency to revert overdoses from these drugs. Again, I'm using carfentanil to show that indeed naloxone can completely prevent the binding of carfentanil, and also naloxone can displace carfentanil from the receptor. So naloxone is actually quite effective. And what you see here is the naloxone at different doses. So you see to your left, actually, the binding of carfentanil when just by itself, when there's no antagonist. And then 1 hour after naloxone, high dose, then 4 milligrams, and then 1 hour after 4 milligrams. And then you see it between 4 and 6 hours later. So perhaps the reason why naloxone is not able to revert completely or save the person's life is because the duration of the respiratory depression is longer lasting than the effects of naloxone. So that's one of the questions. So the issue is that challenging, how do you protect for longer period of time, particularly since you're going to give an antagonist, the patients are going to go into severe withdrawal, which is very disruptive for the individuals. So one of the priorities for us in terms of the HEAL money that we're getting is not just developing formulations for the treatment of opioid use disorders, but also developing new strategies for actually helping be more successful on reversing overdoses. And also recall that I said that many of the fatalities right now are associated with drug combinations. And this gives me the chills, because when I look at the literature and try to figure out how do you revert an overdose that comes with a psychostimulant drug like methamphetamine combined with heroin or fentanyl, there's almost nothing out there scientifically that has been tested. So it behooves us to try to explore and provide new strategies that are likely to be able to help individuals prevent overdoses and revert the overdoses successfully. A big challenge too, and I'm not, you probably are not, if you look at it in terms of the time activity curves, which are injections of carfentanil. Carfentanil and fentanyl get into the brain extraordinarily rapidly, occupying the receptors very, very fast, faster than heroin. So if you are to give naloxone, for it to be effective, you have to be faster in the ability to provide it. And again, the notion of having auto-injectable formulations that can detect this very, very early on. But it's not just about medications itself. I mean, technologies are advancing, and you've heard me present again. I think that as we start to recognize, and in the case of addiction, there has been enormous advances in our characterization of the neuronal circuits that are disrupted by addiction. And as we know how those circuits, the regions in the brain that participate on those circuits, how can we modify them either with behavioral interventions, or how can we modify them with neuromodulatory technologies that can either activate or deactivate areas that play important roles. And again, this is a fascinating area of research where we are just starting to scratch the surface. And ultimately, like we do anything else in medicine, this may be a very good opportunity to combining something like neuromodulation, whether TMS or direct transcranial correct stimulation, to combine it with medications to ensure to enhance retention in treatment. You've seen me present the issue of vaccines. Vaccines have been extraordinarily challenging, where there are many researchers still working on vaccines to try to make them more antigenic. And Kim Janda, for example, has been successful in rodents to actually decrease mortality associated with heroin or fentanyl with a vaccine for fentanyl. But when you bring it to humans, titers never are as high as are needed. So the area that we are now exploring is the development of monoclonal antibodies, which have been shown, Dr. Owen has shown that they are doing a clinical trial in humans for methamphetamine to actually revert in an acute intoxication state the methamphetamine toxicity. But now we know how to manipulate those monoclonal antibodies in such a way that they are not easily degradable. So in the field of HIV, in the field of cancer, they actually have monoclonal antibodies that have a half-life of 6 months. To the extent that we can translate this into the field, we may be able to have up with treatments that can then expand to not just fentanyl or heroin, but go into other drugs for which we have absolutely no medications. So what is the other aspect of where we're investing in enormous amounts of funding? Implementation research, development of new models, services research. How do we do that? One of our main infrastructure is the clinical trial network that is led very, very ably by but Betty Tai and her team, which has for many years now strengthened the partnerships with healthcare providers to bring in the training and encourage them to develop models and to test models that are sustainable for the engagement of healthcare systems in the management and treatment of opioid use disorders. They're also going to embark on addressing some of the very challenging questions that we don't know how to deal with. Like, for example, there are 13 million people that are experimenting with opioids, that are misusing them, that they don't fulfill an opioid use disorder diagnosis. Do we treat them with buprenorphine or methadone? Well, probably not, I think. I do not know. But we need to actually do those studies to evaluate what would be effective, because that's a very significant number of the individuals that are accounting for the mortality, and we need them to prevent them to go into more severe addiction. Also, how long do you keep someone in medications for opioid use disorder? When do you know that you can transition them from an agonist to a partial agonist to an antagonist? When do you know that you can remove the antagonist? Basically, how do you also improve retention in treatment? And I'm going to actually throw another one at you, because I think this is something that we've all going back and forth. As a researcher, and I'm trying to recruit people that have an opioid use disorder, and it has been extraordinarily difficult for us in our imaging program because most of these individuals are on antidepressants. What does it mean that physicians out there are treating them with medications for opioid use disorders and antidepressants? Probably because they feel that the patients have depression. And we now know that the prevalence of the dysphoric phenotype, which is one that George Koof has been speaking on for many, many years, the dark side of addiction is crucial in all of the addictions, but in opioids is an extraordinarily important one that is contributing to relapse, overdoses, and probably something that we're not speaking about, the higher rates of suicide. The justice system is another area of tremendous amount of opportunity, because a significant number of individuals with an opioid use disorder, between 17 and 19%, I don't know what the error bars are on those estimates, go through the justice settings, and yet less than 5% of justice settings provide with medications for opioid use disorder. We need to change that. The data is out there that unequivocally shows much, much better outcomes in terms of survival, retention in treatment, and reincarceration. But it's the challenge of changing a culture. So we're going to create a trial network with prisons and jail systems that actually try to do that, to create a partnership that will allow us, I mean, I think that boldly, what we want to take advantage of this tragedy that we're living, to change the culture on the way that we deal with addiction. It should not be criminalized, it should be treated. But if someone ends up in the justice setting, we have the obligation to provide them with treatment. What are the models that work best, and how do you make them sustainable? So that's what this J-Coin network is going to be doing. And Tisha Wiley actually leads very ably this project. Then the most ambitious projects in implementation that we have done at NIDA. I mean, we've funded an enormous amount of work in terms of actually develop evidence-based interventions for prevention and treatment. Evidence-based interventions that take advantage of healthcare, justice setting, community. But all of them are patchmill, here and there and the other. And so we said, why don't we, right now, look at the opportunity of bringing them all together, because one at a time is unlikely to have a major effect. Bring them together in a comprehensive fashion and evaluate what are the consequences. So welcome to the Healing Community Study that's actually very ably led by Redonna Chandler and her team, who actually have been working with the PIs that were selected for this study. It was a very difficult process, because we wanted states, one grant per state, that had higher mortality rate than the rest of the country. And we wanted them to have communities that were both rural and urban. And we want them to show that they actually have a partnership with the state. And we also want them to show us that they have a very strong connection with their communities. So there were 7 places, and I hope I didn't make a mistake to saying how many there were site visits, but everybody knows. And I think that actually, after that, these were the ones selected. They were Ohio State, University of Kentucky, those are 2 Appalachian areas, New York, and Boston. The process is, the outcome is to try to show that if you do this battery on integrated evidence-based, using healthcare, using justice, using community, you can reduce mortality by 40%. And you do that by increasing the number of individuals that are screened and treated with medications for opioid use disorder. You do that by providing the support system that will enable them to retain them in treatment. You do that by expanding your access to naloxone. You do that by doing prevention interventions. So the study started on April 1st. The funds were started on April 1st. The implementation phase itself will start on October 1st or September 30th, something along the line. And this ends my talk. And I end my talk with 2 slides so that you can see that we have to keep our eyes on the opioid crisis that is moving very, very rapidly. But also as it moves, it forces us to recognize that we cannot just forget the rest of the background of drugs in our country. Because if we just focus on one, of course, the others are going to be emerging. And this is the mortality from overdoses in 2017. The data that I'm showing you now has cocaine and methamphetamine, which I didn't show in the first graph. And if you put those two together, there were close to 25,000 people dying from psychostimulants in 2017. And what's notable about it is not just that the large numbers, but the steep increases that and this mortality, they have creeped up just as fast as that of fentanyl and other synthetics. And you can see the actually geographic distribution of this mortality, how also in 4 years, we have the rates in some of the states going way up. I have to say that there is a certain error in these measurements of mortality, I've been told by CDC, but nonetheless, within that context, it gives you a perspective about how bad it is. So my question, and I want to end up with this, what is it making our country so vulnerable for these drugs? We need to address it from the prevention perspective, because if we don't do that, we will be starting to see the rise of other epidemics, as we are now starting to see the rise with mortality of psychostimulants. So I want to end up with a slide from work of our intramural program, Javin Shaham and his team. We actually give us a clue in terms of one of the most powerful tools that we have as a prevention to protect people from taking drugs and become addicted. Importantly, also, once they are in treatment, to retain in treatment. This is a study in which they use the model that not only the rats, this is in rats, have the opportunity to press a lever to get either heroin or methamphetamine. These are independent group of animals. But they have the opportunity to also choose between the level of the drug or the level of a social contact, which allows them to interact with another creature like them. And when you give them access to this choice, what is extraordinary, and these animals have been exposed chronically to heroin and methamphetamine, what you see is that the animals don't administer heroin or methamphetamine. You choose the social interaction. It's as powerful as that. It overcomes the rewarding effects of the drug. However, if they actually penalize that social interaction by delivering an electrical shock when the animal presses the lever to get the social interaction, or the social interaction is delayed, you can start to see that whether it is heroin or methamphetamine, the drug intake goes up. So what is it telling us? That if we want to protect individuals from taking drugs, if we want to retain them in treatment, we need to build up a social structure of meaningful interactions, where those social interactions are not penalized, but actually enrich the opportunity of those individuals to succeed and to achieve recovery. Thanks very much for your attention. Meg asked me if I am willing to ask questions and answer questions, ask questions. I have a lot of questions to ask, but answer questions, absolutely. So if there are any questions, I'll be happy to.
We don't have a lot of time, but maybe 1 or 2 questions.
Yeah.
So do we have an answer why after 3-4 years of synthetic opioids epidemic in the States, we still don't see it in Europe? There were only some cases in Latvia. They found carfentanil, I think.
Actually, it's an interesting question. Why is it that we are not seeing fentanyl have a more prominent role in other countries? We know that it has clearly a prominent role in Canada. My understanding also, it has started to become appear overdose fatalities in the border of Mexico. There's also starting to see fatalities in England, in Northern Europe. So to the extent that some of it, I mean, where these drugs are actually being distributed is a black market. So to the extent that they can permeate those areas, you will start to see the rise. In the United States, synthetic opioids started to emerge in the northern eastern part, and that's why you saw that very sharp increases. Now they've gone into Florida and some of the northwestern states. So it's shifting. So it has very much to do with black markets. And I would not be surprised that we're going to start to see a jump up into other countries.
Hi, my question's about nicotine vaping, and whereas the data you presented and other data suggest that among, let's say, middle schoolers, there's a pretty high incidence and prevalence of having ever vaped in their life or within the last year, the most recent household data show that vaping 20 or more days out of a month, which is indicative of dependence, was at the level of 0.4% among middle schoolers. 0.4%, less than 1% were actually showing signs of addiction, and that has not changed in the last couple of years. So I wonder what's more important in terms of assessing the so-called epidemic, the ever use, which of course, you know, kids experiment, or the actual regular use, which seems to be very, very low and remaining very low.
Yeah, no, and I presented data that was on past months. So the issue is how many of those kids sustain the use of the vaping. Now, like anything else, we know that the greater the number of individuals that get exposed to a particular drug, the larger the absolute number of people that are going to be at risk. So it's too new of a behavior to actually know and understand what the consequences are. There's been some studies that have looked prospectively at adolescents actually as they start to vape, whether they in fact are higher risk of tobacco smoking. And we are actually doing a study that is being funded, or basically managing a study that is funded by the FDA that's following, as you know, 45,000 individuals, and some of them are actually vaping. They're measuring vaping, and that will give us ultimately the answers. I think that it is clear, as we are facing the issue of vaping devices, that there may be an opportunity for vaping to have some usefulness for patients that cannot stop smoking from other means, but also at the same time is an incredibly effective delivery system for getting drugs rapidly into the brain, and nicotine is quite addictive. So understanding and protecting people from its adverse effects while also at the same time exploring its therapeutic benefits, they are not exclusive.
I was very struck by your last slide and the idea that NIDA is taking social issues behind all these things very seriously. And I'm wondering, are you developing programs in that? Because we need a lot of very multi-focused, different focused research on that. And finally, just as an offer, if you want to do that, I'm willing to help.
Okay, no,
I don't mean for money.
No, we actually need the help of everybody. We are given the responsibility of managing these funds in ways that can accelerate solutions. And the project, and I didn't have time because I only had 30 minutes, so I could not bring all of the opportunities that exist with the HEAL. But one of the most exciting one is that we've also aiming to do in partnership with HEAL and the Institute itself, Alcohol Institute, NIMH, National Institutes of Child and Health Diseases, is the equivalent of the ABCD, but starting in infancy to look at how social environments, those that provide resilience and those that are adverse, ultimately influence the development of the human brain at a period which is extraordinarily sensitive. So we can get that knowledge. How does that interact, how do the genes affect your brain that in ways that influence the environment. So we had a backbone with which to actually understand how much variability there is in individuals and how an adverse environment can impact you. But importantly, how then we can use that knowledge to revert it. So this is one of the projects that we are aiming. We're starting with pilots with the idea of constructing an equivalent to the ABCD study, but for starting in infancy.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Volkoff. Next, I'd like to present Dr. George Koob from the NIAAA to give us his report.
Well, good morning, everyone, and Meg, thank you for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be able to tell you what we're up to. And so I'm going to basically start where Nora left off. And I'm going to talk about what I call a heuristic domain framework for understanding the prevention, diagnosis, and treatment of alcohol use disorders. And I'm going to tell you about what we're doing in the context of this heuristic framework, because that's what's been guiding my thinking over the last 5 years. So this is exactly where Nora left off, only this is people. And these are the deaths of despair. This is the now famous studies by Ann Case and Angus Deaton that have been showing that there's decrease in mortality throughout the Western world, but an increase in mortality in subgroups in the United States. There's a recent paper just came out showing that in younger people in the United States, there's also been an increase in mortality and overdoses and suicides. And they're one of the three things I've circled on the right-hand side to illustrate the etiological factors in these deaths of despair are poisonings, which you've heard an enormous amount about in Nora's talk, suicides, and chronic liver disease. Now, chronic liver disease is caused by alcohol. So half of chronic liver disease in this country is now caused by alcohol. So something's going on in the background of our society. And we're working on this in my staff, but there's a good bit of overlap in that distribution of states that show the high suicide rate and the high overdose rates. And, I just want to remind you that alcohol is a major drug of abuse and still a major problem in the United States. I already told you about half of liver disease. We lose about 90,000 people a year to alcohol. There are 14 million individuals with an alcohol use disorder. And, as Nora pointed out, less than 10% of individuals with an alcohol use disorder get any treatment whatsoever. And I put this slide together again with Aaron White. And it's not to disrespect the opioid crisis, okay? The opioid crisis is terrible. But I want to remind you that when you look at the comparison of opioid use disorder to alcohol use disorder, there's a lot of alcohol use disorder going down. And there are a lot of emergency department visits attributed to alcohol. I remember when I was in San Diego County, half the people in the emergency room on a Friday or Saturday night were there because of alcohol. And there is an enormous amount of deaths associated with alcohol. Some are overdoses combined with opioids, of course. But, just to remind you of your basic pharmacology, and I'm not trying to talk down to you, but when it comes to alcohol and any other sedative hypnotic, 2 + 2 = 5, all right? Because they potentiate each other. And by the way, I just want to remind you, the NIAAA gives out grants too. So what I want to do next is just very quickly go through a kind of conceptual framework for where I see these deaths of despair emanating in addiction. I'm going to talk about some of the things we've been doing in neuroprevention. It overlaps a little bit with what Nora was talking about. I'm going to tell you about some of the things we've been doing in using this heuristic framework, and I emphasize the word heuristic, okay? This wasn't handed down from Mount Olympus to Moses on a stone tablet, all right? I said that once at the American Society of Addiction Medicine meeting, and 2 people wrote me emails saying I needed to take religious studies because it's obviously an oxymoron, anyway. I'm going to tell you a little bit about novel treatments for alcohol use disorder and what we've been focusing on, and then some emerging challenges we have in alcohol use disorder, some of which should sound familiar: high-intensity drinking, drinking in women and older adults, alcohol use disorder and comorbidity, pain in alcohol use disorder, and one of the last things, sleep in alcohol use disorder. So very quickly, you've already heard this. Everybody agrees with the first part of this definition, but I've been emphasizing for years the development of a negative emotional state, dysphoria, anxiety, irritability, which I've defined as hyperkatifia, when access to the drug is prevented. I'll explain that word in a minute. But I just want to remind you in more detail of the framework, okay? And again, I emphasize a heuristic framework, but this heuristic framework came from, in my original work, came from teaching undergraduates about impulse control disorders. That's where it actually came from. It didn't come from rats. But the rat work supports this framework, as does the human imaging work, and Nora's seminal studies, in fact, with some of her colleagues like Rita Goldstein. So there are 3 stages: the binge intoxication stage, the withdrawal never affect stage, preoccupation, anticipation, or craving stage. They have 3 domains associated with them: incentive salience, reward deficits, and stress surfeit. And obviously, for the craving stage, executive function deficits. But they're also, for those of you neuroanatomically challenged, you can see where the nose is here. They're color-coded on this diagram. So obviously, basal ganglia is the blue, and it refers to incentive salience, pathological habits. Negative affect, we focus on circuits associated with the amygdala. And the green, of course, are allocortex and frontal cortex, areas of the brain that we know, in fact, control the blue and the red. And that becomes important. So what is hyperkatifia? Well, I decided to make up a word, okay? I had a number of reasons for doing it, but it's defined as the increased intensity of negative emotional, motivational symptoms and signs observed during withdrawal from abused drugs. I was basically getting tired of saying increased sensitivity to negative emotional stimuli. And so I called up my brother, Steve, who is an archaeologist and curator of glass at the Corning Glass Museum and speaks Greek fluently, and I said, I want a word for, Nora, don't cringe too much, okay? I want a word for dejection, sadness, or negative emotional state. And he came up with katifia, so I put hyper in front of it. It refers to the increases in emotional distress and emotional pain experienced by individuals with addiction during abstinence. It's hypothesized to represent elements such as dysphoria, irritability, alexithymia, symptoms often described as ill at ease, uncomfortable within one's own skin, or simply not hedonically normal. The symptoms are historically difficult to define. So we sent this off to the journal Pain Medicine with 2 anesthesiologists who are good friends of mine, and the reviews came back and they said hyperkatifia doesn't exactly roll off the tongue. So what do you normally do? Well, normally you basically say okay, and you take your word out and you do what the reviewers suggest, but I wanted my word in the literature. So I wrote back, hyperalgesia doesn't exactly roll off the tongue either. They took it. It's only been cited once, but I keep trying. But all joking aside, I use this word now, not so much because I really expect you all to adopt it, but more to emphasize the point that we have neglected a part of the motivation for drug-seeking behavior, in my personal opinion, and that is the part we call from Psychology 101, negative reinforcement, the process by which removal of an aversive stimulus, I'm going to argue hyperkatifia, increases the probability of a response. And, I'm not going to argue with you that that's the only way that you take drugs. Far from it. But what I am going to argue with you is that as individuals progress through the addiction cycle or into the addiction cycle in certain ways, think prescription opiates, or individuals who end up drinking a lot for whatever reason, they end up ultimately taking the drug in relief of negative emotional symptoms that the drug itself caused during withdrawal. I can't tell you that in the alcohol field, everyone wants to focus on hangovers. Hangovers are what everyone's trying to avoid in these new movements to have dry bars, for example. So there has to be something to the fact that there's something that occurs to drive this negative emotional state that's actually of motivational significance. And, you know, we have a lot of data in the field that now argue that these changes in the brain that drive this negative reinforcement don't go away with acute withdrawal. And, you know, there's a lot of work out there and a lot of neurobiology at NIDA and at NIAAA now suggesting that not only do you lose the good guys, the reward transmitters, but you gain the bad guys. And the bad guys in this case are neurotransmitter systems within the extended amygdala and its circuitry that basically make you feel bad and make you stressed and make you anxious and make you irritable and so on and so forth. And I might add, to dovetail with Nora's point, socially deprived animals show the same activation of the bad guys. And isolated animals show the same activation of the bad guys. And individuals, animals who have been socially isolated when they are young, and abused individuals in the human population show the same activation of those bad guys. All right, so now let me tell you a little bit about what we've been doing, and some of it closely in collaboration with NIDA as part of the collaborative research on addictions at NIH. I just want to remind you that in this circuitry heuristic framework, the frontal cortex becomes critically important during development. And you all know that, but this slide just reminds you of old data showing that the frontal cortex is culling itself. There's, you know, apoptosis and removal of neurons that are not necessary, but there's a growth of neuronal projections back to the hindbrain. And what we now know through a longitudinal study that was launched at NIAAA before I came, but I've been supporting since I came. It's a longitudinal study of 800 youth that have been imaged at different time points in their lives and now been followed for 5 years. We've been able to see some short-term and long-term effects of alcohol exposure on the developing brain. And there are structural and functional anomalies that result from alcohol exposure, as well as predict the onset of alcohol use disorder and psychopathology. For example, NCANDA has already generated a number of important findings that include evidence that youth who drink heavily show abnormalities in the frontal cortex of the brain. And there are now a number of studies that have come out of NCANDA to show this result, which suggests that, as Nora's already showed this slide, I'm not going to dwell on it, that we're going to get some really, really interesting results out of the ABCD study. So I'm very optimistic. I'm really pleased, and Nora told you all the details. You know where the data is. Please take advantage of this. On the other side, from the more social side and the social interaction side and you know, health services side, I guess you could call it in some sense, we have seen a steady decline over the last 10 years in underage drinking. Now, I like to take credit for this, but you know, I've only been director for 5 years, and actually, we're doing a testimony to T.K. Lee, who passed away this year, one of our seminal figures in the alcohol field and former director of NIAAA, and I discovered that it was actually T.K. who pushed, for the first time, a major program at NIAAA on underage drinking. And so this corresponds to him beginning this program, so kudos to TK. But in any event, we have developed a prevention guide for colleges and universities for alcohol. It's both community prevention and individual prevention programs. That's called College Aim. And we are developing a core prevention resource that I hope will go out to middle schools and high schools throughout the country, giving not as elaborate as College Aim, but giving at least some examples of prevention programs that we know work and have been replicated in working for prevention of alcohol use in underage communities. While there is a decrease, as you see there, there's still 20% of individuals who are teenagers who are drinking in the past 30 days, and that's still unacceptable. What about diagnosis? How does the work we're doing and how does this heuristic framework fit into the diagnosis framework? Well, one of the things that you may be surprised to know is that fetal alcohol spectrum disorder has an incidence of about as high as that of autism in the United States. And this was a study that was published by Phil May and in a large group, and a big study that NIAAA initiated some 6 years ago in JAMA in 2018. And what we're trying to do is find ways in current research to improve screening, diagnosis, prevention, and treatment of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. These range from three-dimensional facial imaging to neurobehavioral screening tools that can separate individuals with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder from those with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, developing culturally appropriate approaches for prevention of alcohol-exposed pregnancies. We now know from basic research that there's some maternal immune profiles that can be biomarkers as prenatal alcohol exposure and risk of, for prenatal alcohol exposure and risk of neurodevelopmental delay. There's even an ongoing study about how choline actually is more of an anti-inflammatory treatment, not so much as an attempt to restore deficits in acetylcholine, but that study is underway, funded by NIAAA. So, you know, I think the baby cognitive neurodevelopment study that Nora talked about, we're very enthusiastic about this because, again, this is going to help inform and help us with the major problem that constitutes about 1/8 of my budget, which is fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. Very quickly, you know, we've been using this heuristic framework for what we call the addiction neuroclinical assessment, which is really a research domain criteria limited, though, to alcohol use disorders. And this is in collaboration with Nora and myself, but led by Laura Quacco in our intramural program. And she hypothesized a couple years ago now that we could take these 3 domains that I've already discussed with you and identify deep phenotyping from neuropsychological tasks, but also using neuroimaging to possibly individualize the etiology and the phenotype of alcohol use disorders. Maybe there are some people who would respond better to naltrexone because it will block that incentive salience component. Maybe there are others who will respond better to a camprosate because it might ameliorate some of the protracted abstinence. What's really interesting, and this was Nora's idea, I'm going to give total credit, we were sitting around with Laura talking about what Laura was going to be doing in the project that she now has approved in the intramural program. And Nora said, but wait a minute, you've had several hundred subjects go through the clinical center. Why don't you go back and look at them? So in collaboration with NIDA and Carlos Blanco, we did that. And this study examined 3 neurobiological domains that are critical to the addiction cycle in a large, diverse clinical sample from the clinical center, the years 2015 and 2016, that went through all kinds of neuropsychological tests. You can see these on the left, different diagnoses, different scales. And what came out with factor analysis, I'm very pleased to tell you, or I wouldn't be showing this slide, are the 3 domains: negative emotionality, executive function, and incentive salience. So even though I call this a heuristic framework, there's beginning to be data that suggests that you can validate it with large studies, and other studies are underway. I'm not going to dwell on this. We do the same kind of treatment work that you do at NIDA, that NIDA does, that the world does. I guess I would just want to emphasize that we have, as NIDA has done, adjusted our SBIR, SDTR program to facilitate studies leading to FDA IND applications. It's starting to have some impact. We're starting to get a number of compounds far along on their way that we hopefully can test in human laboratory screening studies and then move on to clinical trials. Our framework here is that everything informs everything else. So yes, you can go from the molecular to the animal models to the human laboratory to the clinical trials. But what we're trying to do in the Alcohol Institute is take the data from the clinical trials and the human laboratory studies and feed back and say, okay, what animal models have actually been predictive? I've already told you this. I just want to emphasize to you, if any of you are interested, you know, it's sometimes a challenge to actually utilize all of our SBIR money in an appropriate way. And I want to remind you something that many of you with good grantsmanship expertise know: we cannot spend SBIR money on R01s, okay? It's a chunk of our budget that has to be spent on SBIRs. So if you know someone in the real world who's creative and has a small company, and you have a compound and a target that you think would be equally interesting to alcohol as well as opiates, remember, we give away grants. I mean, we fund grants, too. You know, those of you who work in neurobiology know we have targets out the yin-yang. We have many targets for each of the stages of the addiction cycle. This is just a group of targets that came up from my neuroscience branch. But I want to emphasize that we've actually had positive clinical results with 2 of these targets that are part of the negative emotional side, and that is a vasopressin 1b antagonist and a glucocorticoid receptor antagonist. These studies are ongoing, except that we're not getting pickup by the pharmaceutical industry. And that's another story for another time and another challenge that faces all of us at NIH. Something that's lurking in the background of the opioid crisis to some extent is a phenomenon we call high-intensity drinking. These are where individuals are drinking twice the equivalent of a binge. Just to remind you, a binge is reaching 0.08, that's the legal limit in all states, 0.08 in 2 hours. As a woman, you probably on average reach that with about 4 drinks in 2 hours, and a male 5 drinks. If you double that, you do 8 drinks in 2 hours. I don't recommend it, but if you do that, you increase dramatically the risk of emergency department visits. If you then triple that, it goes up 70-fold. And we have individuals on college campuses, because I've heard these reports, who are aspiring to drink the blackout. And that's what happens if you do double a binge. You're basically at a level where you don't remember what transpired when you were drinking. And you're up 3-fold, you're really pushing the edge of the lethal dose 50% for alcohol, which is around 0.4. Yes, I know, and you can tell me about emergency room reports where people are walking around with 0.6, but that's called tolerance, and I'm not going to go into that today. Anyway, what I wanted to tell you was that we convened a panel of experts in alcohol and drug policy, neuroscience, digital media, social media analysis, adolescent alcohol intervention, research, and global health. And we had a really knockdown kind of drag-out discussion in a very positive way during the course of a day with what I call this Noah's Ark Committee. And the 2 things that came out were cultural and biological. And the biological being tolerance, acute tolerance, which there's a subgroup of individuals in the United States that can drink everybody under the table. And those are the individuals that go on later to an alcohol use disorder. But there's the cultural aspect of that we extol that as a virtue in film and cinema, in sitcoms. So this is an area of further work that we're quite interested in, and we have a team, we're putting together a team to start focusing on this high-intensity drinking and how we can, in some ways, combat it with interaction with the social environment, which you heard about earlier from Nora. So very quickly, some final things. There's an emerging issue about alcohol and women's health. The gaps between women and men are narrowing for prevalence, early onset drinking, frequency and intensity of drinking, having an alcohol use disorder, drunk driving, and self-reported consequences. Women are more likely to experience blackouts, liver inflammation, brain atrophy, cognitive deficits, certain cancers, negative affect during withdrawal and stress, and anxiety-related induced relapse. And there's some preclinical data now supporting the hypothesis that the stress system responds differently with alcohol and opiates in females than in males. And, you know, I just want to emphasize to you, yeah, the clinical studies have been utilizing males and females for a long time, but only 26% of them, a quarter of them, are reporting the actual results. This is changing. You all know it's changing because you're doing female rats in your preclinical studies. But, you know, I think there's a lot of opportunity here and a lot of knowledge that we need. And then this is my group, and it could be a cohort effect. But we are seeing an increase in people aged 65 and older who are drinking and binge drinking in the United States. And you can see both graphs here, and this has been going up, you know, almost in parallel with the opioid crisis. Not as dramatically, but going up. And you know that the elderly are much more vulnerable to the effects of alcohol if you fall and break a hip to interactions with medications because they're taking a lot of medications, et cetera, not to mention the cognitive effects. We're interested in addressing alcohol use disorder and co-occurring conditions. Our major focus has been on PTSD. We have been working with both the VA and Cohen's Veterans Bioscience to see if we can put some more energy into this. We did an RFA to develop, validate, and apply animal models for mechanistic studies of comorbid PTSD and alcohol use disorder. We are talking with Josh Gordon about something to do with this. Well, clinically, we will talk to Nora about it as well when the time comes. But it's still out there. It's not going away. There's a high comorbidity of alcohol use disorder and PTSD and high comorbidity of opioid use disorder and PTSD. And it still needs to be addressed. So this is something that we're putting some energy into. Pain and addiction. You know about pain and opioids, but I want to remind you that alcohol is a tremendously effective analgesic. But there's a catch to it. The analgesic properties of alcohol really only kick in at 0.08, and that's a binge. And there's a beautiful meta-analysis that was just published on that, basically showing those data over a series of about 20 different studies. But there's also pain during withdrawal from alcohol, both acute withdrawal and protracted abstinence. So again, using the three-stage framework, there's a pretty good evidence that pain, definitely emotional pain, could be contributing to the recycling of an alcohol use disorder and the interaction of alcohol with other drugs of abuse. I had a group of clinicians get in touch with me recently from San Diego who work a pain medicine clinic there, and they claim that an inordinate number of their patients are actually drinking alcohol, even though they claim they're not drinking alcohol. And one of the things we've been working on, and still under development, is a biosensor that can actually measure alcohol in real time, and it's being tested in a number of locations, and hopefully that will be helpful in these kind of studies. And finally, I just wrote a review with Ian Coleraine, who's one of the world's experts on sleep and drugs of abuse, and particularly alcohol, for neuropsychopharmacology reviews. It just got accepted. And, when you start driving down into the sleep literature, you realize that alcohol can create insomnia, and insomnia can create relapse. And I know Meg Haney's very familiar with that, as a number of the clinical people here. And so, sleep is a largely neglected area and in the treatment of alcohol use disorder and in the prevention of alcohol use disorder. So it's another area we're going to put some energy into. And then finally, that I've already mentioned to you that there's fewer than 10% of people with an alcohol use disorder receive any form of treatment. We want to improve physician training in substance abuse prevention and treatment at all levels. We want to integrate prevention, early intervention, and treatment into routine health care. We've been working with Jack Stein and Nora and others at NIDA on this for years. It's not an easy nut to crack, but I've decided to do two things. We developed a treatment navigator that helps people find treatment programs, but also understand what an alcohol use disorder is. That's out there. We're developing a clinician's navigator, which will be to help clinicians be able to find treatment facilities, kind of Rolodex version of the NIAAA treatment navigator, and a clinician's core resource. I'm not going to do, a core curriculum. They work for one university, they may not work for another. What we're going to do is provide the core information you need to know about alcohol and get it out there for everybody: nurses, physicians, clinical psychologists, pharmacists. And this is what I've been talking about. So it's going to be called the NIAAA Clinician's Core Resource, what every clinician needs to know about alcohol. And I'm not going to go through all this. We're not going to be setting up protocols for how you detox patients with the delirium tremens, all right? We're going to let ASAM do that. But what we are going to do is say that these are the symptoms of delirium tremens. These are what you need to look out for. These are some of the this is where you can go to find standard protocols. So, this is really my last slide, gaps in translation. The neurofunctional domain encompassing the withdrawal negative affect stage has been neglected, is going to be my argument. I think in diagnosis, the addiction neuroclinical assessment measures and better biomarkers are a first step to differential phenotypes of alcohol use disorder, a first step to individualized, personalized treatment of alcohol use disorder. We need to bridge for treatment 2 valleys of death. You've heard this before, IND and phase 3. And we need to educate the medical community that we have treatments that are available, as Nora pointed out. And then we have a number of emerging challenges in the alcohol field. Some are unique to alcohol: high-intensity drinking, drinking in women and older adults, alcohol use disorder and comorbidity, pain in alcohol use disorder, and sleep in alcohol use disorder. So we have lots of stuff out there if you're interested. And again, I'll reiterate, the NIAAA does fund meritorious grants. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Koob. And this is no way my showing preference for NIDA over NIAAA, but I'm afraid we're running really late and we don't have any time for questions, and I don't want to run into posters. So I think we just will move forward, and I'd like to introduce Dr. Mike Taff to give the award for the Stephen G. Holtzman Travel Award.
Morning, everybody. It is my tremendous pleasure to introduce Jacques Nguyen, postdoctoral fellow for the Holtzman for 2019. Jacques has spent just over 4 years in my lab. He did his undergraduate work at Notre Dame, and then he went to the University of North Texas Health Sciences Center to do his doctoral training with Dr. Michael Forster and Dr. Michael Gatch, who's familiar to many of you here. I'm encouraging him not to seek only a job with Michael in the future. So when he joined my lab, I gave him the opportunity to work on everything, which really turned out to be, would you please work on everything? And that has been something that turned out to be true. And so he's worked on our stimulant work with cathinone bath salts. He's worked on developing our inhalation techniques for intrapulmonary delivery of drugs to rats. And he's worked on our oxycodone projects. In this time, since joining my lab, he's had 12 publications, of which 8 are first author. He's energetic, vigorous, and creative. Perhaps more importantly, Jacques has been instrumental in collaboration. So he's started new work when he first joined my lab with our recently departed colleague, Larry Parsons. He created new collaborations with the Janda Laboratory for vaccines, including for oxycodone. And he worked with the laboratory of Dr. Marisa Roberto on some neurobiological consequences of oxycodone abuse. In addition to this, Jacques is to be commended for an early interest in doing service work for his academic communities. He was a Washington Fellow with ASPET, which meant he went to Capitol Hill to lobby Congress on behalf of science and addiction science. He has been a postdoctoral trainee representative on ASPET's Behavioral Pharmacology Committee. And more recently, something you just heard about, Meg Haney tapped Jacques to work on the Code of Conduct, which was recently distributed. So he has an interest in contributing to his community. And finally, for an award named after Dr. Holtzman, it would be remiss to not address mentoring. So Dr. Holtzman is revered, has been mentioned many times in the course of this award for his mentoring. And Jacques has shown an early talent for supervising undergraduate trainees in my laboratory, for taking a hand in assisting with junior trainees that might have come in behind him in the laboratory. And I think it's fair to say that Jacques has become a sounding board and a tremendous help to postdocs and graduate students in the department that don't happen to be in my laboratory. So it's my great pleasure to introduce this fine young man, a creative, vigorous scientist, and a credit to the college. Jacques, please come up.
I just wanted to quickly thank the Holtzman family, the CPDD Award Committee, the leadership here. Mentorship matters. I'm grateful that I've received very great mentorship. Attendance at this meeting matters. So just like Meg had said, I encourage all trainees to participate, be involved, do what you can. Thank you again. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Chuck. Next, I'd like to invite Meg Chisholm up to present the CPDD NIDA Media Award.
Good morning. So each year, the CPDD NIDA Media Award is given to an individual who has helped increase public awareness of substance use research and treatment. Nominations are solicited through members of the college, including its media committee, and I want to thank this year's committee members for their immense work in preparing and reviewing the nomination packages. So the votes are in, and it's my privilege to present the 2019 CPDD NIDA Media Award to filmmaker Elaine McMillan Sheldon in honor of her film Heroin. It's a Netflix original documentary that examines the courage of 3 women, a fire chief, a judge, and a street missionary, as they work on the front lines of the opioid epidemic in Huntington, West Virginia. Huntington is a town with an overdose rate 10 times the national average. But within this distressed landscape, Ms. Sheldon shows us a different side of the fight against drugs, one of humanity and one of hope. Heroin won an Emmy Award and was nominated for an Academy Award, and the film's impact has been far-reaching. Hundreds of communities across the country have hosted screenings of the film, as will we here at CPDD tomorrow night at 5:45 in Grand Oaks EF. It's a short film, only 38 minutes long, but it tells a powerful story, and I urge you to join us for the screening. In recognition of her clear commitment to increase public awareness about opioid use and its treatment, please join me in recognizing Elaine McMillan Sheldon as the recipient of this year's Media Award.
Just want to say thank you. Thanks to Aaron Winstanley for this nomination from West Virginia University. It's been really interesting morning to hear what you guys have in your conversations, very similar to what we have in the documentary filmmaking world of talking about how to address biosocial, psycho, and how to do it in a way that shows the humanity. So thank you for this.
Next, I'd like to invite one of our own, Loretta Finnegan, to give the Martin and Toby Adler Distinguished Service Award.
I am pleased to have the opportunity to introduce Mr. Charles O'Keefe as the 2019 recipient of the Martin and Toby Adler Distinguished Service Award. Mr. O'Keefe is professor in the Department of Pharmacology and Toxicology and the Institute of Drug and Alcohol Dependence at the Virginia Commonwealth University. He has dedicated his career to the service of several areas that have been extremely beneficial to the field of drug dependence. He utilized a number of innovative methods not previously exploited to make contributions to our field, including beneficial toxicology services, education related to addiction, use of unique methods to provide an important pharmaceutical agent for the treatment of opioid dependence, now available for many individuals dependent on opioids who were not being well treated with other medications. And finally, he has had extensive involvement in public policy, contributory to our field. Mr. O'Keefe managed the largest clinical toxicology laboratory in the country, providing urine toxicology services to the Department of Defense for troops returning home from Vietnam. He also developed the first abuse-resistant, child-resistant dosage form for dispensing methadone for take-home patients. He served as Deputy Director for International Affairs in the White House Office of Drug Abuse Policy and as Assistant to the President for International Health, where he worked with the United States Senate to support ratification of the United Nations Convention on Psychotropic Substances. In the education area, he coordinated the universities of Adelaide in Australia, King's College in London, and the Virginia Commonwealth University to establish the International Program on Addiction Studies, which awards a Master's of Science degree from the combined universities to students around the world. Additionally, he was instrumental in bringing the Hubert Humphrey Fellowship Program to the Virginia Commonwealth University. Prior to joining VCU, he served as president and CEO of Reckitt Benckiser Pharmaceuticals, as the company and NIDA proposed under a cooperative research and development agreement to develop buprenorphine products for the treatment of opioid dependence. He negotiated with Congress as it came to agreement on the Drug Addiction Treatment Act, which, for the first time in nearly a century since the Harrison Narcotics Act of 1914, allowed physicians to treat opioid use disorder patients in the privacy of a physician's office. The treatment is now available in 40 countries. More than 2 million patients have been admitted to buprenorphine treatment in the United States since its approval. These changes in regulatory and legislative areas were among the most significant changes in the field of drug dependence in this century, and Mr. O'Keefe's creativity made it happen. As an individual who is accomplished in so many areas, CPDD was delighted to welcome him as a member of the board of directors, where he was always involved in providing sound, excellent advice and service to our organization. He was one of the founders of the Friends of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, in which CPDD is a member. In summary, Mr. O'Keefe's commitment to service has exerted a major impact on the treatment of opioid dependence. His many meritorious contributions have made significant changes in order to improve the outcome of those individuals who are opioid dependent. Charles O'Keefe engineered critical changes in the policy of the United States regulatory legislation and scheduling, which has made a major impact on our capacity to respond to the current opioid epidemic. For these and many other contributions, and most notably, his service commitment to the field of drug dependence, it is my honor to present the Martin and Toby Adler 2019 Distinguished Service Award to Charles O'Keefe. We have to do it this way because he went.
Take a picture?
Yes.
Thank you.
Loretta, thank you for those flattering words. Most of you who know me recognize I'm as highly inflated. The biggest honor of getting this award is to be able to receive it in the presence of two of the many people who founded this organization and who nurtured it into the organization it is today, and for whom it was made, Martin and Toby Adler. It's a real privilege. But the accomplishments that Loretta mentioned are not mine. They really are the compilation of all the accomplishments of the people, many of whom are in this room today. It's not a question of what one person can do. It's a matter of collaboration. And there's no organization more fitting to do collaboration than than CPDD. We can do a lot of things individually, but we can't do anything that is meaningful unless we collaborate with others. This organization is composed of epidemiologists and clinicians and psychiatrists and all sorts of fancy scientists, and a few people like me who are not scientists. And the reality is that when we all come together at meetings like this and have discussions, all of the things that Loretta mentioned were originated in groups and in presentations and in arguments and discussions at meetings like this, primarily here. And they all began right here at CPDD through the collaboration of good science. So if the people who've gone before us have a message to us, it's collaborate. Collaborate here, talk to the people that are people who you don't normally work with. That collaboration will benefit science and will benefit public health. Thank you, Loretta.
Okay, next we have the Joe Cochin Young Investigator Award. I'd like to invite Scott Lucas up to present this.
Good morning. Happy Father's Day to you men, and to you men and women. Happy Father's Day to your fathers. They help bring us all here today and make us what we are, just like mentors and mentees. This is by far the best part of being in this college, getting an opportunity to acknowledge the next generation of scientists who have shown the dedication, the ingenuity, and the enthusiasm of carrying us forward and helping those less fortunate than ourselves. As I look around this auditorium, I see lots of old friends and colleagues and new faces, and yet I'm reminded of those who are no longer with us, who helped put this college together, and I often wonder how they would think about how the college has turned out, how my old mentor Joe Brady would feel about us as a college, or how Dr. Cochin would feel about the future, and I think about what he would say about it. And you know, unfortunately, I never had the opportunity to work with Dr. Cochin, but I certainly met him a couple of times, and I benefited from his wise and sage wisdom. And I'm here to say that I know that he would agree the college is in good hands. The college is in good hands. When I let it be known that Drs. Nancy Ator, Jack Bergman, and I were going to nominate Steve for this award, a plethora of letters came in, and I'm just going to take about a half an hour to read a few choice snippets. Actually, I did hack into your Twitter account, I'm sorry, and this one just came in at 3 a.m. Hi, Steve. I'm sitting here watching Fox News, and I learned of your award. I'm just going to say that you are by far the greatest scientist that ever lived, and all those other scientists are morons, complete idiots, total disasters. No one can compare to you. You are very, very talented, extremely remarkable. Believe me, everyone agrees. I never lie. In fact, I'm too honest to be a politician. Sorry, I couldn't resist since the plug of the... All kidding aside. Here are some real quotes. Author of 30 peer-reviewed papers and book chapters. His K01 application deserves special attention. Translational models of brain activation patterns during nicotine self-administration reinstatement received a perfect 10 on its first submission. He currently supports his research with that K01 that I just mentioned, as well as an R01. At the time this letter was written, he has since added a second R01, and a third one received a 13. Regularly attends CPDD, serves on both the Animals and Research and Program Committees, local committees at McLean. His KO1 submission should serve as a model of scholarship and narrative construction for aspiring young researchers around. He developed a training plan that would successfully transition him from a very successful behavioral pharmacologist to a even more successful neuroimaging by studying the brains of non-human primates while they were awake and self-administering nicotine. Think of how difficult that is. I'd like to acknowledge how inventive he is when it comes to developing the tools needed for his KO1. He constructed a miniature mock scanner to acclimate the monkeys during training, complete with video and sound systems, an innovative restraint system. Finally, I believe Steve is an outstanding young investigator candidate for the award based on his scholarship, research funding, engagement in mentoring already for new scientists, and with our scientific community. Please join me in recognizing and congratulating Dr. Stephen Koenig as this year's Joseph Koshin Young Investigator Award.
So I think this is the only situation where I'm okay with following Scott on the stage. So I will be quick. I'm truly honored to receive this early career award. I'm particularly here at CPDD. CPDD has been the one meeting that I've attended consistently since even before going to graduate school. It was the first national meeting that I attended, the first meeting where I gave a talk at a conference. Made so many friends here and established important collaborations. So this is really a very special recognition for me. I'd like to thank the awards committee for choosing me for this award. And I'll end by recognizing the mentors that I've been fortunate enough to work with and have had a tremendous impact on me and my career. Ellen Walker and Nancy Ator, who opened my eyes to research and behavioral pharmacology in particular. My wonderful graduate and postdoc advisors, Tony Riley and John Katz. The late Nancy Mello for bringing me to McLean and Harvard and kind of setting the course for my career. And finally, Jack Bergman and Scott Lucas, who have just been invaluable sources of career guidance and counsel over the past several years. So thank you.
Lift this heavy number of, it's just way too heavy to carry.
Great. Next, we have the Mentorship Award, and I'm going to invite Catherine Woodstock-Striley up to present.
Good morning. On behalf of Dr. Ty Ridenour and Dr. Wilson Compton, as well as the mentees of Dr. Linda Bauer-Kotler in this room, and would you mind standing up really briefly? I'm extremely happy to share this nomination with you. As many of you know, Dr. Kotler spent 30 years as the director of the Epidemiology and Prevention Research Group. We're going to show lots of good pictures at Washington University, where she directed 2 NIH T32s and a Fogarty ICORTA. She's been, for the past 8 years, the founding chair of the Department of Epidemiology and a Dean's Professor at the University of Florida, where she began an NIH T32 and another Fogarty. Dr. Kotler's work has had a huge impact nationally and internationally, as you see in some of these pictures, on prevention and intervention methods, culminating in international invited faculty positions, training grants, internationally recognized diagnostic assessments, and different degree programs, in addition to NIH-funded programs and training grants that prepare pre- and postdoc fellows for independent research careers. Her mentees can be found across the globe, and in most of her 300 publications, she has mentees as co-authors. Her mentees have been high school students, undergraduates, and all the way through senior faculty. Dr. Ty Ridenour said of her, "Her mentorship was crucial in my career development, as it was for dozens of other nationally recognized scientists whose research investigates various facets of addiction. Her attention to detail and commitment to get it right is imperative in this area of substance abuse research, and I am fortunate to have received this training." Dr. Wilson Compton said, "Dr. Kotler took what she learned firsthand about the importance of a mentor through her work with the remarkable Dr. Lee Nelkin Robbins, and has applied that knowledge throughout her career. I was one of these mentees and can testify firsthand to her wonderful guidance and support. For me, this was perhaps most influential as I shifted from clinical training as a psychiatrist to full-time research career. Dr. Kotler served as my mentor during these earliest stages and helped to guide me through early grant writing, including funded K awards and early R01s. We then transitioned into a partnership where we co-led a number of research projects at Washington University, an excellent reminder of Dr. Kotler's long-term commitment to her colleagues. Dr. Kotler exemplifies the very best in methods in her mentoring, which I've seen over the past 20 years, in her epidemiological research, teaching, and service. She's an outstanding leader and an internationally known and recognized scientist. I'd like to repeat what Dr. Kotler and Dr. Kathleen Buchholz said in a tribute to Dr. Robbins. Like so many others, we count ourselves among the many fortunate who have benefited from her wisdom, intelligence, counsel, and grace. Linda is a wonderful colleague, mother, grandmother, citizen, mentor, and lifelong friend. I'm very pleased to present Dr. Linda Bauer Kotler to you to receive the CPDD Mentoring Award. That's good. Luckily, it's wood.
Happy Father's Day. Thank you so much to CPDD Awards Committee for this honor. Thank you so much for those wonderful, kind words, Kathy. Thank you for nominating me. Thank you, Wilson, for nominating me, Ty Ridenour and Tamara Millay for nominating me, and thanks, Katina, for being here today with me. Thanks to Matt, my husband, and my daughters, Emma, Laura, and Sarah, for sharing me with you, my research family. And thanks, Emma and Patrick, for being here today and bringing my youngest mentees, Collins and Bauer and Miller. Thank you, Nida, Nora, for continuously funding me since 1989, and for our NIDA T32 especially. And thanks, George, for your support as well, and for all of your future support that you're going to give us for all of our meritorious grants. I want to acknowledge my mentor, Lee Robbins, who was tough and taught me everything, and to our mentoring mosaic, people of all ranks and levels who help one another to make the best contribution to improving the public health. As Kathy said, we have middle schoolers, we have high schoolers, we have the NIDA Summer Scholar Program, which is wonderful. We have the pre-docs, the postdocs, and our faculty. Being a mentor is so satisfying, but mentors are not perfect. So thank you all for your patience and for allowing me to have a small part in helping you do the best. And to all of you who have mentored me throughout my career, thank you all for helping me to do my best. This award means so much to me, but you mean even more.
Okay, I'd like to ask Loretta again to come up and present the Innovator Award.
It is indeed a pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Bertha Madras as the recipient of the 2019 Innovator Award. The Innovator Award, sponsored by Indivior Incorporated, recognizes individuals who have developed innovative approaches in basic science, clinical research, or treatment and prevention science that reflect groundbreaking strides with the potential for significant impact in the field of drug dependence. The award will be presented this year, and next year, the awardee will deliver a lecture in the context of a symposium at the annual meeting. Dr. Madras is a professor of psychobiology at the Harvard Medical School and directs the Laboratory of Addiction Neurobiology at McLean Hospital. She has pioneered in most domains of the Innovator Award with significant impact for drug dependence. Her accomplishments include groundbreaking advances in basic neuroscience, translational research, and public policy. She is honored with this award because of her efforts in translational research. Bertha was a true pioneer in discovering the remarkable properties of phenyltropane analogs of cocaine as exceptional, selective, and specific candidates for probing the dopamine transporter and dopamine neurons in postmortem tissue and in living brain. The dopamine transporter is a key target of psychostimulants with therapeutic and abuse potential. She developed the most widely used probe, 3-hydroxy-Win35428, for monitoring these sites in vitro, and pioneered in the use of phenyltropanes for imaging these sites in living brain. With collaborators, she reported the first technetium-labeled probe to enter the brain and target these sites. Since her early publications in 1989 and 1990, over 1,500 manuscripts have used phenyltropane analogs to investigate this target in living brain for over 25 disease states, including addiction, such as the following. 1, addiction or toxicity research on cocaine, methamphetamine, and MDMA. 2, alcohol hallucinosis and withdrawal. 3, medications development for methamphetamine and cocaine. 4, psychiatric disorders, for example, depression. And 5, motor diseases, for example, DAT deficiency syndrome and Parkinson's disease. Her collaborative research group used this imaging agent to discover, 1, that an extended release formulation of methylphenidate had markedly slower offset times that were associated with reduced high than immediate release methylphenidate. And 2, that modafinil targets the dopamine transporter in living brain, kindling clinical trials as cocaine medication. And 3, that non-coding region of the dopamine transporter gene is correlated with dopamine transporter expression in living brain, implying specific genotype modulation of dopamine signaling. And 4, that potent transport inhibitors she co-invented that contain no amine nitrogen fail to enter the brain, implying potential as transport inhibitors at peripheral sites or as inhibitors of conventional psychostimulant accessibility in the brain. She is the recipient of 19 U.S. and 27 international patents with collaborators. The 2006 Better World Report cited her brain imaging invention as one of the 25 technology transfer innovations that changed the world. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bertha Madras, the 2019 recipient of the Innovator Award.
Uncharacteristically, I'll be very brief because we're running short of time. I thank CPDD and its leadership, Dr. Loretta Finnegan, for this honor. CPDD can boast of its longevity. It is a testimony to its crucial role that it serves for research policy nationally and globally. And to my colleagues here, your research and insights now are needed more than ever before because we face public challenges related to drugs as never before in our nation. For me personally, it's an auspicious time to thank so many people who have collaborated, who've been colleagues, and for the leadership that we have at the government level, Dr. Nora Volko, who has led NIDA with extraordinary talent, skill, vision, and wisdom. Any scientific career could remain a childhood dream, an unreality, without the input of others. There are too many to list, but I offer an especial thank you to all the colleagues and people that are here that I've worked with. Among the ill or departed, I mourn for them, for their families, and long to rekindle a dialogue that we will never have again, that catalyzed discovery and the profound joy that comes from new pathways of thinking. Above all, I'm deeply grateful to the many colleagues and collaborators that helped me achieve daily euphoria from research. This euphoria is far more concrete, far more satisfying than the confidence tricks played on one's mind by drugs. Thank you.
So finally, I'd like to invite Eric Strain up to present the Nathan B. Eddy Award.
Thanks, Meg. So give me a shot when I'm 5 minutes in, okay? Because we're behind, I know. First, it's my pleasure to be introducing Maxine Stutzer as the 2019 CPDD Eddy Awardee. First, I want to thank Warren Bickel and Jim Sorensen, who wrote letters of support for this as well as the co-nominators for this award. I'd also like to thank Andy Koop and the awards committee of CPDD for this. I realize there are a number of outstanding candidates each year for this, and they agonize over it, but came to their senses this year and made the right decision. So I'm going to talk about Maxine. I thought I had 15 minutes. But I'm going to try to be briefer than that because I'm eager to hear her comments today. So Maxine did her undergraduate at the University of California at Berkeley, got an MS and a PhD at Michigan, spent a year as a research associate at Michigan, and then 2 years at the Worcester Foundation for Experimental Biology in Massachusetts. She then settled in Baltimore, where she joined George Bigelow and Roland Griffiths in the Department of Psychiatry, and I'll be coming back to those chaps as well, and advanced through the ranks at Hopkins. Her 40-plus year career has encompassed a variety of themes, and she demonstrates a characteristic that I have come to appreciate is often present in Eddy awardees, that their career is not focused on a single issue over the span of their career, but rather tends to dive into an area for several years, study it in a rigorous and exhaustive manner through a set of studies and resulting papers, then makes a substantial contribution to our understanding of that topic, and then they pivot and they move on to the next interest that comes to our attention. This is certainly the case with Maxine, and while she's continued to study some topics for much of her career, she's often been able to switch gears and take on new areas. This characteristic of Maxine demonstrates the underlying nature and quality of her as a scientist and the Eddie awardees, I would argue, as scientists. And her ability to do so productive and be so productive in so many areas seems to be one of the compelling reasons for this award. So let me get started trying to summarize Max's career in now 4 minutes. Some of the areas she's made a major contribution in have included contingency management, methadone treatment, nicotine dependence, acute physical dependence, and the clinical trials network. And there's a lot of science for me to cover in 15 minutes, let alone 5 minutes. So let me get started with contingency management. I'm not going to do that. I haven't got time. I'm going to start talking about Maxine. So this is Maxine at 15 months old. And this is one of the few slides where she's not smiling. Okay. There she is at 6 years old, Max, right? And one of the things is she's always smiling. So we see it here, 6 years old. This is her, I think you're around 13 in this picture, if I've got it right. She's nodding yes. And this next slide, I particularly like, the hairdo, which hints, I don't think you were in Baltimore yet, but I think this hints that you were meant to be in Baltimore with that hairdo. If only you had crossed paths with John Waters. Yeah. Here's another one, again, smiling. And here it is, I think this is this one, which gives that, this is sort of the characteristic Maxine smile. I took it out, but I would just say there are multiple wine bottles in the back of this picture, Max. And then this, sort of changing gears, I want to talk for just a moment. This is Max, obviously, on a hill hiking. And while Max is a scientist, and I'm going to come back to that, another side to Maxine is her love of hiking and trekking. And here she is away from a professional setting, and what I think is just a really lovely picture of her on the hill. And this is a love that's shared with her husband, Duncan, who's here today. I took the slide out that showed a picture of Maurice Gibbs, who's one of the Bee Gees, because, Duncan, you have an eerie resemblance to Maurice, who died several years ago, and I'm not sure if Duncan comes into Max's life right around the time Maurice Gibbs dies, which makes me wonder about that. But I'm not going to go into that divergence for today. But she and Duncan have shared a love of trekking. Here they are hiking. And here's another one where they're in Glacier Park and National Park. And here's yet another one. I think this is in the Himalayas, if I'm right. Yeah, I've got that right. So, and that's a wonderful side to Max if you don't know her as well. But I want to get back, while she was hiking the world with Duncan, she also continued her work at the Behavioral Pharmacology Research Unit at Hopkins with Roland Griffiths and George Bigelow. I want to get back to that. This is a picture of George and Roland, of course, from recent years. She was one of the foundational rocks for the BPRU. How's my time doing? This is another slide from the earlier years, as evidenced by the width of George's tie, with George and Roland. And this is also with Herb Lauder, who is the administrator with them, and Ira Leibson, the psychiatrist who for many years was a part of the BPRU. And really, this was the core foundational group that made that. I've done 6 minutes, okay. Her work has been recognized by the college. She was the recipient of the Marion Fishman Award, but also by a number of other awards, the Niswander Dole Award from the ATOD, the Brady Schuster Award from the American Psychological Association, the Betty Ford Award from EMERSA are just a few of those. And she's been training a generation of investigators. This is a list of her postdoctoral fellows that I could find, I could put together. There may be others. I apologize if I've left them off. I'd note that she's had at least 5 CPDD presidents as trainees, and at least 5 Joseph Cochin awardees as trainees as well in her career. But there's another side to Maxine as well, besides the professional one, and that is her work as an artist. And this has been this artistic side of her as a dancer, a singer, a performer. Here's another shot. I'm going to, for the sake of time, go through these quickly. I'm not sure what this was, Max. Here she is in a production recently, and this one, I think you're a queen in this production. This is not people at the BPRU and how we have to act around her. At least that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. And here's another one, which again, I'm not quite sure. I think this is the Dickeyville 4th of July celebration, a neighborhood that she lives in as well. And Max really has this wonderful artistic side to her, which I wish I could spend more time elaborating upon today. But she's been an integral part of the Behavioral Pharmacology Research Unit and its success for 40 years. And this is a group shot that was done just recently, which captures some of the people associated with the BPRU in recent years. And it's always tough to know how to pick a shot with a group. Researchers, this is, I think, my last slide. And I just want to say, researchers like Maxine are a lot like artists. That's the point I want to end on. And these are comments that I actually made at another event, but I tweaked a little bit that honored Maxine. Artists are unique in what they do. They're creative. The good ones don't simply keep producing the same thing like a painting or a sculptor over and over again. They're passionate about what they do, and they're enthusiastic about their creations. And scientists are a lot like artists. Max is an artist. She's an artistic scientist, and I suspect she brings the rigor and discipline of her scientific skills to her artistic outlets of song, dance, and acting as well. To have an opportunity to be on the stage with her, to experience her energy, her passion, her excitement, is one of the infectious thrills of working with her. She's unique and irreplaceable. As I think many of you know, she has decreased her time and effort in recent years, and the decrescendo of her energy, creativity, and scientific voice is a loss to all who work in our field. Our stage lights in the scientific area may be dimming for you, Max, but your impact, influence, and presence will remain a vivid part of us and inspire us all to be as creative in our work and lives. Thank you for letting us be a part of your life, and congratulations on this award. How'd I do? 7 minutes? 8 minutes?
Well, I wish that was my Eddie talk. That would have been great. Thank you so much, Eric, for sharing all those memories. Well, I am trying to retire, but like I've said to some people, you guys have tricked me, because by giving this award, I now have to give a speech. Oh, well, here we go. I'm calling the speech My Brilliant Career, because it is a retrospective of the work that I've done at Hopkins over the last 44 years. Yes, it's been that long. Now, I didn't make up that title. I borrowed it from a novel and a movie. The novel is by an Australian author named Miles Franklin, and the story, it's been made into a movie. That's not me in the picture. That's the actress who plays the heroine in the movie. So her name is Sibylla Melvin. She's the heroine of the book. She grew up at the turn of the century in the outback of Australia and dreamed of becoming a writer, a novelist.
and had to overcome her poor background in the outback. Now, the parallel for me, I grew up in the outback of the Los Angeles suburbs and dreamed of becoming a scientist. So Sibylla and I both got our wish, and we did it by being clever, persistent, and lucky. Where's my, it's right there. This one? Yeah. The green button. Thank you. Okay. I came to Hopkins in 1974. So that was 44, almost 45 years ago, and my intention was to do human research. There certainly was a wonderful wealth of preclinical animal research that had been done, but it seemed that human research in addictions was kind of in the Stone Age, or at least in its infancy. So where did things stand at that time? Well, tobacco cigarettes were killing people right and left. Opiate addiction was endemic, at least on the East Coast. People were being sent to Lexington, to the federal prison for possession and use. And drug addiction was viewed as a moral failing, with the model of treatment being therapeutic communities like Synanon, where you had to hit bottom before you could be helped. Well, there were some promising starts, though, to human addiction research. The Addiction Research Center at Lexington was characterizing opioid dependence in humans in a very nice, rigorous fashion. Vincent Dole, Marie Niswander, and Mary Jean Creek had repurposed methadone, the long-acting treatment medication, as a treatment for, long-acting pain medication as a treatment for opioid dependence, and shown how effective it could be at returning people to a normal life. And animal self-administration was reconceptualizing drug taking as biologically reinforced behavior. That was really an exciting and important development at that time. And there were beginning attempts at controlled human research, such as the work of Jack Mendelson and Nancy Mello. But so it wasn't exactly a blank slate, but there was a lot of research opportunity back in those days. When I got to the Behavioral Pharmacology Research Unit, I found a really rich setting and rich set of resources that really helped my career and those of my colleagues to be successful. We had at that time a residential research unit where volunteers could be administered or self-administer drugs of abuse under controlled and medically monitored safe conditions. We had a small methadone maintenance research clinic that came in very handy, as you'll see, for some nice research. Pretty soon we had the T32 postdoctoral training program that supplied a really endless, seemingly endless source of wonderful, talented, and hardworking people to help with the research. It's okay. We had inspiring colleagues. Is the microphone okay?
Yeah, I would just push it away a little bit. Yeah.
Push it away a little bit, okay. A collaborative team approach that made the work both rigorous and pleasant to perform. And it didn't hurt that there was a rising NIH budget. So now what I want to do is the little retrospective, 44 years and 45 minutes, my career in the rearview mirror. And I've chosen 4 of those topics to kind of hop, skip, and jump through to give you a flavor of the kind of research that was accomplished during all this time. I just put it in a different order than what Eric did. So let's go. Part 1, acute physical dependence. We know that physical dependence is a key aspect of opioid pharmacology and a barrier to abuse-free pain medications. That was the case when I started and still the case today. But it's interesting to ask how physical dependence develops. How long does it take? What are the conditions for escalation? So this work was inspired by that of our wonderful deceased colleague, Steve Holtzman, who had shown in his animal research that opioid physical dependence actually begins with the very first exposure. And this was animal research and very elegantly done. So what I wanted to do was to bring that into the human laboratory. And you see some of the postdocs that worked with me on these early projects with physical dependence. So the question is, what are the dosing and temporal parameters of physical dependence development in humans? The tool we used was naloxone challenge to unmask subclinical symptoms of withdrawal, and the strategy was to manipulate agonist and antagonist doses and interdose intervals. So this was like the first study, dose-ranging studies for morphine and naloxone, and indeed we were able to demonstrate acute physical dependence. After a single injection of morphine at appropriate dose, we saw precipitated withdrawal symptoms, like irritability, upset stomach, and we even saw some tearing and yawning. And so we could do that with appropriate doses of morphine and of naloxone. And having identified the doses, they went on to look at the, manipulate the interdose intervals to discern the onset and offset of this effect, this acute effect. So in the onset study, we give like 18 milligrams of morphine and then manipulate the interdose interval from 0 to 360 minutes. We see that the onset of this physical dependence is apparent by 45 minutes and peaks by 90 minutes. So whatever these cellular and receptor processes are that are underlying physical dependence, they're developing within the first hour with a delayed onset course compared to agonist effects of the opioid. In the offset study, we manipulate between 6 and 72 hours, see strong precipitated withdrawal at the short intervals, very mild at 24 hours, and then after that, if the interval's longer, no precipitated withdrawal. So that 24-hour interval was really handy then for looking at conditions of escalation. And this is, so we posited that if additional morphine or agonist pretreatments were given prior within 24 hours, that we would see escalation, more intense withdrawal precipitation. And, but if the intervals were longer than 24 hours, we wouldn't, and that's exactly what happened. Just an example of a study that gave 1 versus 2 morphine pretreatments, and the open circles are the single pretreatment, very, very mild symptoms precipitated, but with 2 exposures to morphine given at appropriate intervals, you then saw a more intense precipitation of withdrawal. So we were able to demonstrate in this systematic series of parametric studies, we demonstrated acute dependence. We saw that escalation was observed when morphine interdosing intervals were 24 hours or less, but not if the intervals were greater than 24. That's why people can be opiate shippers. They can use opiates very occasionally without developing physical dependence. But since the physical dependence changes last longer than agonist effects, there's a danger of escalation even when daily agonist exposure, even with once-a-day agonist exposure, at least with the morphine, the drug that we used. And it's kind of ironic that we stopped this line of research in view of today's opioid crisis, because I think it would be interesting to know the parameters of physical dependence development and escalation in humans with current-day pain medications, including dosing parameters that are needed for detecting spontaneous withdrawal without the naloxone challenge when people stop their pain medications abruptly. So a question thrown out, maybe somebody will take this up. Part 2. Once physical dependence develops, you think, what's that? Okay, really? You think that's better? Yep. That's better. Oh, okay, I'm so sorry. Once physical dependence develops, medication-assisted treatment is the recommended course of action. And I mentioned that methadone had already been developed as a treatment for opioid dependence, and it was in use quite broadly at clinical centers around the country, but the clinicians were tending to use low doses, 50 milligrams or less. I think they were just scared of giving high-dose methadone at that time. So we wanted to do some parametric work to explore higher dose methadone and to look at some optimal parameters for methadone dosing. This was one of Eric Strain's studies when he was a mere postdoc in our lab. And it was a 20-week study with random assignment to 0, 20, or 50 milligrams. Actually, there had never been a placebo-controlled study of methadone, and so we were able to do that. And how we did it was by giving a 6-week taper at the beginning of treatment, followed by placebo maintenance with access to all the clinic counseling and medical and so forth
But of course, it was double-blind, so the patients didn't know what dose they were receiving. We got some very orderly data. Here's retention, with 0 milligrams having very poor retention. 20 milligrams, I think, surprisingly good, considering how low that dose is, and 50 milligrams looks like it's maintaining about 70% retention for these 20 weeks. It's really interesting to look at the withdrawal symptoms because the folks who stayed in treatment on 0 were reporting symptoms, of course, but even dose as low as 20 milligrams was able to suppress those physical dependent symptoms. And that's the reason that methadone can be used clinically at such low doses, because some patients are willing to tolerate it since they're not feeling withdrawal. But when you look at the opiate positive urines, indicating opiate use during treatment, you see that 50 milligrams did the best. That was the lowest rate of opiate positives in the squares. 20 and 0 didn't do very well. But even 50 milligrams didn't completely suppress opiate use. So we wanted to look at higher doses, and to do that, we took it into the residential research unit to examine opioid blockade with higher doses of methadone. So this is an elegant study. I see Sharon Walsh is out there. This was led by Eric Donnie and Sharon, and it was a really elegant parametric study in the residential unit where the patients were maintained sequentially on 30, 60, and 120 milligrams of methadone. And after they had stabilized on each dose, they were given a challenge, a cumulative dosing challenge with heroin. Yes, we applied for an IND and actually used the very drug that folks were testing the blockade with in the community. So you can see that the 30 milligram maintenance dose in the squares didn't do a good job at all at suppressing these subjective effects when folks were asked, how high are you? 60 milligrams, okay, get some suppression, but it isn't until 120 that you see pretty much complete suppression. And even there, at the 120, there's a little bump at the higher heroin dose. So a very elegant parametric study looking at those higher doses. So this careful research supported the effectiveness of higher methadone doses. Withdrawal suppression at the low maintenance dose allows these to be used clinically, but doses of 100 milligrams or more are needed to effectively block the subjective opioid agonist effects. And of course, Mary Jean and Dole and Niswander already knew this, but I think that our research helped to bring the point home. And dosing practices did in fact change after this. We like to think our research had an impact on this. Now, just to remind you as well that during this time, this early time at the BPRU, there was some seminal research being done on buprenorphine, the development of buprenorphine safety and efficacy. I participated in this, but it was led really by Ed Johnson, George Bigelow, Sharon Walsh, and Eric Strain. Careful laboratory work characterized the pharmacology, and pivotal clinical trials provided data for FDA approval. So this was our medication development work, and at the end of it, Eric and I published a book, The Treatment of Opioid Dependence. And I was just going to say, I'm going to sell it out in the lobby after the talk to help to support my retirement. So it's a little out of date now, but that's okay. It has historical interest, right? So we summarized the state of the science at that time and the clinical implications, and thought that was a nice way to wrap up that area of research. So now I'm going to let your brains have a rest from opioids and go on to part 3, which is a completely separate line of research that I did all the way throughout my career that I kind of thought of as my second career because it involved a different network of people and a different topic, which is nicotine and tobacco research. So why do this? Well, nicotine and tobacco was a public health crisis that could not be ignored. That was really going on strongly at that time when we started our work. 25% of the general population were smokers. This was a prototypic addiction with a high prevalence. And of course, all the drug users smoked cigarettes. It was, so a prototypic addiction with a high prevalence and lots of participants available. Back in the early days, tobacco withdrawal syndrome was just being characterized. Nicotine replacement products were being developed with opioid substitution as the model, and the environmental smoking restriction was just beginning. In fact, our hospital at Bayview was one of the first to have where the patients and staff couldn't smoke. But we nevertheless could set up tables, research tables over in the hospital, and enroll employees who were smokers in some of our studies. Now, we did a whole lot of different things in nicotine and tobacco, and I'm showing you here some of the postdocs who worked with me on these studies. And you'll recognize a few of them because they went on to have really successful careers themselves in this nicotine and tobacco area. That would include Scott Leishow, Tom Eisenberg, Eric Donnie, and of course, our own Jack Henningfield. Well, some of the things we did, we characterized tobacco withdrawal over 10 weeks post-cessation to show that most of the symptoms dissipate quickly, except hunger and eating, which underpins the weight gain that many people experience. We did some more work with weight gain. We showed that if you actually chewed enough nicotine gum, you could forestall or at least postpone or reduce that weight gain. So that was interesting. We looked at abuse liability of some of the new NRT products and showed that the abuse liability was lower than for cigarettes. And we developed a nice experimental model of smoking cessation and relapse that we used to study reinstatement effects, and I'm going to show you some data on that in a minute. I think that the most impactful and interesting line of research that we did in the nicotine and tobacco area was the research with low nicotine and denicotinized cigarettes, because this research has provided some background for current day research and policy debates. So early on in this line of work, Jim Zachney showed that smokers could defeat the commercial low-yield cigarettes just by taking more puffs and larger puffs. All they did was put more ventilation into the filters and dilute the smoke stream. So all the nicotine was still there, you just had to take more in order to defeat that particular strategy. But then the real denicotine cigarettes came along, the ones that had nicotine chemically removed, and we did research with those showing that they suppressed craving and withdrawal and promoted relapse in a paid abstinence model. So I like to show this because I just think this was a fun study and an interesting one. This was the model. Basically, we paid smokers to stop smoking in their natural environment for, in this case, it was 10 days. And at time 0, the participants, they had already been off cigarettes for 4 days in this paid abstinence. They had to be abstinent to qualify for random assignment at time 0. And they were randomly assigned either to continue earning money for not smoking. Well, everybody continued to earn money for not smoking, but some of them were instructed to smoke some cigarettes, either that contained nicotine or didn't. They smoked one in the lab and a couple out in the environment. And what you see there is that the people who smoked the cigarettes returned to smoking or relapsed more quickly and at higher rates than those who didn't smoke the cigarettes. So we thought about this as a programmed lapse, like simulating what happens to people in the natural environment when they slip and lapse on a cigarette, and that's associated with return to smoking. And we showed that you could do it in a controlled way with a paid abstinence model. And it's also similar to the animal reinstatement studies, which showed that animals exposed to drug cues would return to self-administration. So it's not surprising that we got these results, because denicotinized cigarettes have a lot of conditioned cue properties that would promote reinstatement. But another question that we addressed that is maybe even more interesting is testing the extinction hypothesis. So this is the hypothesis that was promoted by Jack Henningfield and Neil Benowitz, 30 years ago now, I guess, huh? That if you take the nicotine out of cigarettes, you'll remove the addictive compound, and there will be no reason to keep smoking the cigarettes, that smoking behavior might just extinguish. So the question is, will people continue to smoke if nicotine is removed? And this was another elegant study that was headed by Eric Donnie, done on our residential research unit, where participants were randomly assigned to smoke nicotine-containing or denic cigarettes over a 12-day protocol. Now, if you look on the right, the enjoyment ratings, they didn't like those cigarettes. They didn't like the denic cigarettes very much. They didn't like them as well as the nicotine-containing. And as far as behavior is concerned, on the other panel, you can see that there was an effect on behavior. The people assigned to denic cigarettes smoked at lower rates. They smoked fewer per day compared to those with smoking nicotine cigarettes. But interestingly, after the first couple days, the rate of smoking stabilized and continued, so smoking continued during those 12 days. So the extinction hypothesis wasn't really supported the way, at least I would envision it. Now, since that early work, which as I say, provided background for current research, there have been large multi-site clinical trials sponsored by the FDA where smokers are randomly assigned to cigarettes with varying nicotine content. And those studies, I would say, have found very similar results to what we saw in that residential unit. People continue to smoke very low nicotine cigarettes for prolonged periods of time, but at a lower rate than what you see with usual brand. And we've been participating in those multi-site trials, so really the participation in this line of work has been continuous. Now, while the results of removing nicotine may not be as dramatic as expected in terms of extinction, the FDA is currently proposing to regulate nicotine at low levels in order to reduce exposure to toxins and to reduce addiction potential. I'm not going to get into a debate about whether this is a good idea or worth the effort. You all can comment. They're soliciting comments about this. But it has been really gratifying to be in this line of research that has continued to be important in terms of informing science-informed policy debates of the current time. So that's been a gratifying trip through an area of science. Okay, let's go back now to methadone and drug abuse. So our patients were smoking, and we noticed that some of them also used other drugs like benzos and cocaine. Furthermore, the cocaine epidemic of the 90s fueled the need for effective behavioral treatments of substance use disorder in general and stimulant abuse in particular, where there's no medications. Enter Part 4, contingency management. So, inspired by the behaviorism of B.F. Skinner and the recognition from animal self-administration that drug seeking is biologically reinforced and therefore subject to the principles and laws of behavior, we at BPRU pioneered the application of contingency management to the clinical problem of drug addiction. And here you see George Bigelow and myself cleverly photoshopped into our pioneer costumes. And we actually got a joint award for this from the Association for Behavior Analysis a few years ago for a translation of science into practice. So, as I say, we noted that the methadone patients were using drugs like benzos and cocaine during treatment, even though their opiate use was controlled by the methadone. We recognized that urinalysis testing provided a nifty objective marker of recent drug use versus abstinence, and we thought positive reinforcement in the presence of abstinence might be effective at countering the drug reinforcers, provided that the alternative positive reinforcers were sufficiently potent and attractive. So the protocol is very simple. A drug-negative urine sets the occasion for delivery of a positive reinforcement. What would those reinforcers be? Well, we asked our patients what they would like to have, and we identified money, the universal conditioned reinforcer for humans, and also take-home medication. In a methadone clinic, the chance to take a bottle home with you and miss a day at the clinic is a very desirable privilege, and it's a discrete event that may not lose its potency as a reinforcer over time. Now, I'd really like to show this study. This is my favorite study because it was published in 1982, and the results of this contingency management proof of concept study are so reminiscent and similar to all the findings that have come since. So I think it's kind of cool to look at it. We took a handful of benzo users. You can see their percent of negative urines pre-treatment was very low. During the intervention, that percent negative shoots up to a little over 50%. And then when you withdraw the intervention, you see the behavior returning to its pre-treatment levels, which shows how powerful the intervention was. So what was the intervention? The participants, the patients, they gave urines 3 times a week. If they were negative for benzos, they could choose a reinforcer, either $10 or a single-day methadone take-home. So they could earn 3 take-homes in a week or $30 or mix that up. During treatment, so what you see in the pattern, if you look at the individual pattern of performance during treatment, what you see is the reason you get 50% negative urines is because about half the people decide it's worth their while to stop using drugs and earn the alternative positive reinforcers. And as I say, that both the rate and the pattern of outcome is so similar to much of the research that's come since. So a prototypic study, I guess, published in 1982. Now, what we did a lot of work. We did a lot of proof of concept studies, small studies, looking at various drugs, looking at various reinforcers, looking at schedule parameters like urine testing frequency. But there were important things happening outside of the BPRU. First of all, Steve Higgins, who was one of our early postdocs, went up to Vermont and invented the voucher reinforcement system. This is a case where points have cash value and are used as rewards every time the participant gives a negative urine for the targeted drug. And that's a continuous reinforcement schedule, so every urine is awarded points. And actually the value of the negative urines increases over time in order to make sustained periods of abstinence more valuable. Shortly after that, Nancy Petrie cleverly used the principle of intermittent reinforcement to invent the fishbowl method. Here, where tickets are drawn from a bowl, not all of them are award prizes, only half of them do. And the value of the prizes, there's many more small prizes than large prizes. So this was very clever use of intermittent reinforcement, and she was also able to show that this worked at lower total cost than what had been the case or what had been used with the vouchers. And that was clever too, because it was appealing to clinicians to have something that cost less. I want to remind you that it was already noted that we very, very sadly lost Nancy Petrie last year due to a recurrence of her breast cancer, and there's going to be a symposium this afternoon at 3:45 honoring her contributions that were her brilliant career that was cut short by this terrible disease. So come to that symposium, please. This is just another example of the kind of parametric research we did. This is led by Ken Silverman, cocaine-using methadone patients, randomly assigned to earn nothing, just usual care, to earn the single-day take-home or to earn take-homes plus vouchers over a lengthy 52-week period, showing the dose effect of reinforcer potency and also showing that you can maintain very nice high levels of response over lengthy periods of time if the reinforcer is sufficiently potent. So looking back on the contributions that I made at BPRU to contingency management, I would say that I wouldn't say inventing it, but being the pioneer was really important. Continuing the research, persisting with that line of research was important, but even more important was training the future CM researchers. And I've listed some of the people who worked with me and went on to have careers in which they continue to investigate and utilize contingency management and make further developments. So that has certainly been an important, I think, contribution. Now, much of this early addiction treatment research, medication as well as behavioral studies, were conducted in small research clinics, like our clinic, like Steve Higgins' clinic, and I even started another clinic that I called Cornerstone, which was a drug-free treatment clinic that used abstinence contingent housing as the reinforcer, and did some nice studies showing that that worked well, but I don't have time for that today. But I was very proud of that project too. Well, anyway, soon became recognized that it was time to abandon those small research clinics and start testing research-based treatments in community clinics in order to bridge the gap between research and practice. There was all this nice evidence-based interventions, but they weren't really being used in practice. So we wanted to begin by introducing the community clinics to these practices and retesting them, if you will, in larger samples and community settings in order to show effectiveness. So enter the Drug Abuse Treatment Clinical Trials Network in 1999, which is still going strong today, as you saw in Nora's talk, and this provided access to real-world clinical sites and patients. This was a project that I jumped into with great enthusiasm, becoming co-PI of the Mid-Atlantic Node with Robert Schwartz, my colleague at Friends Research Institute, and continued to lead that Mid-Atlantic Node all through these years since 1999, until a few months ago when I decided it was time to retire from Hopkins. One of the joys, the great joys of the CTN was early on that I was able to co-lead with Nancy Petrie the first large multi-site study conducted in community treatment programs, the large multi-site study of contingency management. It was a simple randomized design with usual care, delivered with or without the prize draw incentives. People could earn about $400 in prizes during this 12-week intervention. The target was stimulant use. And we did parallel studies, 2 of them with the same protocol, one with stimulant users in methadone maintenance clinics and the other with stimulant users enrolled in drug-free counseling. And we were able to show effectiveness of the intervention in both of these settings. But in the drug-free counseling, the main outcome improvement was on retention. Why is that? Because a lot of people who come to these drug-free programs have already stopped using their drugs when they enter treatment. And so you get a ceiling effect on the drug use outcome. But often they will drop out of treatment if they relapse to drug use. So retention becomes a kind of imperfect surrogate measure of abstinence. So we had a significant effect, improved abstinence in the incentive condition, and improved retention in the incentive condition. And in the methadone program, we saw results that were very typical for what we had been seeing in our research settings. The patients who received the contingent abstinence incentives delivered about 60% negative urines, again suggesting that about 60% of them stopped using their cocaine for a prolonged time in order to earn the incentives. That was significantly better than the 40% or so negative urines that we saw in the control group, and the only difference is that the control group did better than what we were used to seeing in our research settings, maybe because of patient selection factors or whatever. Now, the Clinical Trials Network has also been an instrumental platform for a couple of other advances in contingency management research since that early multi-site study, that multi-site study being very important in the history of contingency management. One was the HOPE study that tested patient navigation for HIV-positive substance users, and that was tested with and without a contingent incentive program. So the navigators actually delivered incentive reinforcers for a variety of targets that had to do with promoting health care in these HIV-positive patients. And we showed that the incentives promoted substantial increase in the targeted healthcare behaviors. Those were behaviors like going to meet, keeping your appointment with the navigator, going to see the doctor, and having an active HIV medication prescription. And that was a really gratifying project for me. I got to help design that multi-target intervention, which is one of the first of its kind, and that was designed with Don Carlson at University of Washington, who's also sadly a deceased member of our community. The other one, good, interesting study was the web-based treatment study, or the therapeutic education system. This is a web-based treatment that has 2 major components: cognitive behavior therapy modules that patients can take on their own, can study on their own, and abstinence incentives. It has a program in there for delivering abstinence incentives. It uses the prize draw method to award prizes when negative urines are detected. Now, the interesting thing about this particular study is it was done in these outpatient counseling programs with all comers, so it didn't matter what their drug of abuse was when they came in to the program. And the rewards were given for primary drug and also for all secondary drugs as well. Effectiveness was shown for those not based on the kind of drug people were using, but based on their behavior at the start of treatment, whether they were actively using drugs or not. Those who were not actively using drugs, again, we had this ceiling effect and didn't show any improvement with CM, but those who were actively using showed a significant benefit. And this particular web-based treatment program has now been reprogrammed or deployed or whatever you call it into a phone app. And I'm going to say another word about that in a minute. So taking a step back to look at contingency management in perspective. Addiction researchers really like it. A lot of researchers use CM in their studies. There's a huge body of research demonstrating efficacy for every type of substance abuse, for HIV medication adherence, for appointment attendance at all kinds of services. But the approach is less widely liked and used by treatment providers in clinical practice, despite the strong evidence of its being an evidence-based and effective practice. Some of this has to do with the convenience of delivery, with having the workforce that can actually do it. Some has to do with familiarity and comfort with the concepts behind it. Some people say, well, we don't want to pay people to do what they should be doing anyway. And some has to do with the cost, finding the money to support the contingent incentives. But there are some new developments I just want to make you aware of that are really, I think, going to improve the ability of CM to be disseminated and adopted more widely in clinical practice. The first is remote sample testing technology. That's really revolutionized the delivery of contingency management. This is where patients can take testing devices home,